About the author. Craig James Harris is a first-time novelist from Stoke-on-Trent, England. He attended Berry Hill High School and Stoke-on-Trent Sixth Form College and graduated with a 2:1 Politics and American Studies degree from Keele University in 2011. He went on to found a successful clothing company and has maintained a keen interest in helping ambitious young historians, writers and artists to succeed in their craft. Introduction. In a world ravaged by nuclear war, our heroes grow up in a Tesco Extra known only as the Ark. Scavengers, these hideously brave young men and women search for food, supplies and artefacts. Their people rely on them as much as they fear them. The barren wastelands of Stoke are swarming with marauding slavers, flesh-eating cannibals and sick abominations too abhorrent to describe. Yes, it's fair to say Stoke was pretty much unchanged by the nuclear holocaust that decimated Britain. Starring a fantastical cast of characters of stunning originality and imagination, Gramslinger, badass mind reader, Flora, beautiful and deadly, Steve Rogers, no, not that one, he just has the same name as him, and Craig, he's a cat but he's all man, as well as two not as good characters that aren't important right now. A tale as old as time that is set in the future, but also is kind of just the present day. It's such a thrill ride that none of it makes sense, but by gum you'll certainly agree that it is written semi-competently and doesn't infringe too blatantly on any copyrighted works, so it's actually quite good by Wattpad standards. You'll laugh, you'll cry, you'll maybe get slightly aroused at one point, and then once you've finished doing all that, you'll sit down and read this story I wrote. Enjoy. Mutants of Stoke, Chapter 1. It turns out water is kind of important to humans. The residents of the Ark were getting slightly anxious about the water situation. Not unreasonably, concern had grown as to how to survive ever since the water supply failed. Numerous suggestions were made: live off supplies and hope for rain, dig and search for groundwater, and one suspiciously excited man repeatedly put forward the idea that they should start drinking each other's piss. However, the elder came up with a solution. He tended to do that. His quick thinking had helped him to reach pensionable age, a rare feat in the new age where there was actually no such thing as pensions, though his quick thinking had begun to slow down in recent months. The solution espoused by the elder would of course rely on the work of a party of scavengers. 3 young men and 1 teenage woman were selected to complete the task of relieving the Ark of its drought by going out into the nightmare world that existed outside the relative comforts of the Ark and returning with a new water source to nourish the weakly residents of the Ark. The elder, surrounded by his loyal officers, was cheered as he told the fearful and desperate residents that this intrepid party wouldn't fail in their duty. However, he knew that the loyalty of his officers would soon disappear if the party failed. He reasoned that he had had a good run, he had always known that one day he would die, and he was quite comfortable with the thought of the Ark dying with him. With the elder's words of praise still ringing in his fiercely adorable cat ears, Craig stepped outside of the Ark's front doors and into the cold and frigid long-tongue air. He had done so many times before, but now he felt a sense of trepidation and fear. It was natural to feel fearful at the prospect of walking the wastelands, but this fear was different. It was a fear of failure. The whole Ark expected him to succeed, for if he failed, then they would perish, and a slow death was not something the residents of the Ark could countenance. Still, he reasoned, he had 4 strong companions with him. He would not fail. Stepping out alongside Craig was young Gramslinger with his pet dog. The waterproof shoes he had traded much of his supplies for would prove highly useful, or so Gramslinger thought as he looked down at the menacing-looking clouds above. His thoughts turned to that of Craig beside him. He wondered what Craig could do with that tail, and then shook his head. This was no time for such thoughts. He must only use his brain power to work on solutions for the Ark's current predicament and the party's dangerous mission. Gramslinger saw a look of steely determination in Craig's handsome face and felt reassured, but couldn't help but use his telepathic powers to sense an undertone of fear in Craig's thoughts. Gramslinger scolded himself once again for violating his companion's mind, and tried to tell himself that soon they'd be returning as heroes back in the safety of the Ark. Steve Rogers shuffled out the Ark next. Weathered and wise beyond his 21 years, Steve could smell the rot on the wind. Whilst others would be revolted and terrified of such an odour, Steve's rot-eating mutation allowed him to feel at ease. Though he had to remind himself that the boundless rot of the wastelands would soon overwhelm even his mutation and leave him dying in agony. He looked at Craig, the leader of the party, and felt unnerved at the uncomfortable look on Craig's face. Steve felt his hands reach down to his shotgun, and he said to himself, "If Craig fails, then we all die. I must protect him." He cocked the weapon, leaving the others bemused as to why he had just wasted a perfectly good cartridge. Without meaning to, Elon pushed past Steve and stood in front of the Ark. Elon grunted an apology and sniffed the air with his cute little bear nose. The nose was an anomaly, though, as the rest of Elon's massive frame could hardly be described as cute. A bear of a man, quite literally, he was a man with the mutated appearance of a bear. The elder felt that the party could do with some muscle on their mission, and, besides, if they were to fail, then Elon would not be a welcome presence as the residents fought amongst themselves and the Ark leadership for survival. "How rude," commented Flora, the last of the party to exit the Ark, as she saw Elon's brusqueness with her good friend Steve. Flora had been assigned to the Ark due to her sharp wits, mind terror abilities, and because she had tried to strangle Leroy after she caught him trying to steal his stuff. The elder had a thing for Leroy and found Flora to be quite a nuisance. All the party were expendable, but particularly so Flora. Her cold blue eyes surveyed the wretched freedom of the outside world as she felt the wind blow through her dyed hair and send a shiver down her back as it travelled past the nape of her neck. Flora assessed her new companions and addressed Craig. "So, what's the plan?" He looked up and down, noticing the ragged clothes and highly unsuitable footwear. The wastelands would be an unforgiving place for pomps, he mused, as well as the delicate and fragile frame that the rags clung to. Craig contrasted this sight with that of the 3 large men that would also be accompanying him on the quest, and wondered why the elder would send such a dainty creature out to the unforgiving wastes of Long Tongue. Her intellect and mind powers must be truly powerful, he thought, as an irritated Flora told no one in particular. "I think we should go right," as she wandered off to the left. There was something intriguing about this girl, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. "Stop tearing at her arse and tell us where to go," Elon demanded. Steve stopped examining his gun to look up in bemusement, as Gramslinger and Craig protested Elon's outburst. "I don't swing that way, I'm actually straight," Gramslinger insisted, as the others looked at him quizzically. "I'll tell you where to go, you fat prick," Craig retorted. He looked at his map, which was completely blank aside from a circle marked as the Ark. He marched off to the left, overtaking Flora, and led the party for some 200 yards. To the right of the party, some hideously mutated creatures were munching on the weeds that grew up from the concrete that once constituted a road. "We should kill them," Elon growled, but Craig disagreed, telling the party to only fight when absolutely necessary. They carried on walking, careful to avoid making any loud noises, though not going so slowly as to bring the poor inhabitants of the Ark any closer to mutiny. A sign to the side of the road was unreadable to the party, aside from Craig, as he was the only one who knew how to read. "The sign tells us that the city centre is this way. We will surely find water there," he told them. The party trudged on, grateful to the clouds in the sky for not unleashing a torrent of rain on them, whilst also shielding them from the harsh glare of the sun. Craig noticed that Elon and Steve were grumbling to themselves. "Any opinion?" he barked at them. We could have easily taken those grazers," Steve answered. Craig sighed, but was surprised to hear Flora speak up and say, "Shut up, you nerd. Our mission is to find water, not fight grazers. The elder said to only fight if we had no choice." Elon spat out, "Spoken like a true coward." Flora, feeling frustrated, said, "Yeah, well, your mom." The groups fell silent. "She's out of line, but she's right," Craig remarked. "About my mom?" Elon whispered back. "No, about not being reckless," Craig continued. "Time is of the essence, people. We can't—" His words trailed off as the jarring sound of metallic clanking filled the air. The party stood in silence, trying to gauge the sound to work out what could be making such a horrific noise, and how quickly they should run away from it. Flora sneaked off to the side of the road. She is a brave one, Craig thought to himself as he joined her in peering over the broken concrete slabs. What they saw fascinated and terrified the pair in equal measure. They witnessed a giant metal construct. The construct had 4 legs and 6 arms, which encompassed what could only be described as a giant mouth. The arms were picking up nearby pieces of scrap and feeding this mouth. What this thing was built for, they did not know. "Now there's a worthy opponent," Elon stated. Craig and Flora turned to face Elon in disbelief. "What did I just say?" Flora hissed at him. Craig spoke up. "If you want to fight that thing, then you're on your own. We're going round it." The others agreed, and even Elon seemed secretly relieved that he would not have to face the construct, as he witnessed it crush a small car in its menacing jaws. Gramslinger's dog began to whimper, and his master began to comfort it. Flora's face began to twitch. The stress of the wastelands had begun to tell upon the inexperienced members of the party, and yet the journey had barely even begun. With his dog leading the way down the ruins at the side of the road, Gramslinger diverted the party through a nearby warehouse that had long since been abandoned, possibly many years before the start of the new era. The warehouse looked ominous, but held no nasty surprises for the party, who were nevertheless much happier to exit the building and return to the road, with the construct now in the distance, having seemingly headed in the opposite direction. "Is everybody happy?" Craig asked. Gramslinger, Steve and Elon replied in the affirmative, though Flora remained silently twitching. He looked at her and asked, "Are you okay?" Seemingly resenting the question, she responded by simply saying, "I'm fine." The party continued on their journey, unnerved by the encounter with the construct, but relieved to have been thus far unmolested. The sun began to break through the clouds and leave the party feeling uncomfortably warm. It seemed unfortunate that the clouds had so far refused to rain. Though their own supplies were healthy, they knew that back home the others were running dangerously low on water, and a rainstorm was much needed. As they reflected on their friends' increasingly dire situation back at the Ark, the party noticed that breathing was becoming more difficult. Gramslinger began to choke as thick smog hung in the air. Flora's eyes began to water, and Elon felt his nose start to tingle. A loud rumble passed through their feet as the party struggled to handle the thick smog. The dog began to whimper again, though the others were too focused on the unpleasantness of the sky to pass comment on what could be going on under their feet. Gramslinger spoke up and said, "We must keep going. We can't turn back now." His dog looked up at him in approval, as if it could understand his words. The dog and his master had a close bond. Too close, some would say. Sometimes dogs end up looking like their owners. Well, as Gramslinger was a half-dog, half-human mutant hybrid, it's fair to say they looked more like each other than any owner and dog had done in the before times. The group persevered through the more than inclement weather. They coughed, choked and spluttered their way on through the dense fog that had enveloped them. Steve had fashioned a sort of makeshift mask from his underwear that helped his breathing. Flora had rummaged through her bag and found a broken gas mask that provided some measure of support for her breathing. Craig and the others had to endure the smog without any such devices. He kept a firm grip onto his book, evidently concerned that something might appear out of the darkness and swipe all knowledge the people of the Ark had collated on the outside world. Eventually, the party made it to Han and Lee, what had once been the central hub of the potteries. The smoke slowly cleared, leaving them to drink in the sights of what had once been a relatively thriving and modern city centre, at least compared to Sarajevo after 4 years of siege warfare, or as compared to the Plague Village during the Middle Ages. In truth, it looked much better since the intensive bombing raids of the 2020s had flattened much of the skyline and decimated the local population. They wandered around, marvelling at the blue clock tower that towered above at a height of at least 9 feet. Elon reached up and touched it. Wiping away a tear, he proclaimed, "It's just as it was described in the bedtime stories my mom read to me." Steve was just grateful to be breathing relatively fresh air again, relative to the fact that radiation permeated every corner of the wastelands and that he was still wearing his underwear on his head. Gramslinger carelessly wandered off from the others and was dumbstruck by what he found among the rubble. Reaching up amid the urban decay was a large and beautiful tree covered in apples. "Come quick!" he exclaimed to the others. The rest of the party were equally bewitched by the sight of the giant tree, and they all stood there gawping for a few moments before Steve said, "We should fight the tree. I'll find an axe." But even Elon balked at such a suggestion. Flora piped up, "We should collect the apples and bring them back to the Ark. We can use the pips to plant our own apple trees and feed the Ark." Elon smirked. "What a nerd," he stated scornfully. "Yeah, well, your mom," Flora retorted, still not having quite grasped the concept of a witty retort. A nerdy suggestion or not, the party gathered a collection of the finest apples into their rucksacks, whilst consuming more than a few themselves. The apples were a very welcome bonus for the group, but they still needed to accomplish their primary goal of returning to the Ark with water. Clouds returned to the sky, however, giving them hope that it would rain later and bring relief to the thirsty inhabitants of the Ark. Craig suggested that they move on and look for something that could aid their cause, and they duly split up to look for clues. It was Craig who found the clue, a big store with wheelbarrows outside that said B&Q on the sign outside. "Quick, everyone come here," he shouted. "I've found a Wilco's." The others hurriedly gathered round, delighted at such a prospect. The store had indeed stocked a wide variety of highly practical items before the rapture, and much of the stock was still salvageable. The party ran inside and again split up to look for clues. Craig felt that finally he would get what he was after, and it was Flora who provided it. "Look at this giant butt," she called out to him. "Yes, it's very peachy, and I'll marry some more later, but right now we need to find something to collect the rainwater in," he replied. Frustrated, Flora said, "Well, that's what I found. I found a water butt," her voice breaking as she spoke. The others gathered around Flora as beaming smiles covered their faces. "This is perfect," Gramslinger said, and they all agreed. Now their thoughts turned to how to get the water collection devices back to the Ark. All eyes eventually turned to Elon. Craig had been distracted staring at the butt again, while Steve was wondering if it was safe to take his underwear off his head yet. It was agreed that Elon would be able to carry all the barrels, butts and buckets in wheelbarrows the party would attach to his limbs with rope. They had just started to connect the devices to their half-man, half-bear hybrid when Gramslinger's dog came rushing back to his master. "That dog should probably have a name," Craig mused, as a concerned Gramslinger comforted his pet. Craig's cat ears picked up a frightening noise, which the rest of the party soon heard as well. It was apparent what had made Gramslinger's dog so scared. A group of wild dogs were scurrying towards them, and as they came into view it was plain to see that they were starving hungry and determined to feed on mutant flesh. 5 dogs surrounded the group, growling, barking, and slobbering in anticipation at their next meal. Suddenly, a great roar came from behind the water capture devices. Elon erupted in fury and descended on the lead dog, taking its head in his giant hands and crushing it. What continued was a gruesome sight. Elon went through the wild dogs, one by one, crushing their heads with frightening ease. The dogs managed to wound before their demise, though with the adrenaline Elon had barely noticed. It managed to wound Elon. Elon sat panting among a bloody pile of corpses. The others looked on, staring at him with wariness and appreciation. Craig was the first to speak. Well done, Elon. Now, would you say you're still okay to carry these devices back to the Ark?" Elon's panting grew more controlled as he slowly arose and returned to the group. "Sure, no problem," he smiled. The ease at which he committed such brutal acts and then returned to a calm serenity unnerved the group. Steve wiped away a tear, though he insisted he wasn't bothered by the gory scene that had unfolded in front of him. The group helped Elon to take hold of the water collection devices and made their way back to the Ark. Craig insisted, against the wishes of the others, that they should make their way back via a different route so that they could note down the terrain of unexplored areas. He sketched and doodled and made notes as they passed through the harsh terrain outside of the main through road. It provided a safer path to home, though. Walking off the beaten track, they did manage to catch a glimpse of what looked to be a devourer, though it was too far in the distance for any one of them to be sure. The group eventually had the Ark in their sights. They looked up hopefully at the sky and saw the rain clouds gathering. "Perfect timing," Craig whispered to himself. It was then that they spotted their first sight of other humans. A group of 12 travellers approached them. They seemed to be a large family. They looked friendly and intelligent. Perhaps they could join the Ark, Craig thought to himself. Tragically, a swarm of rats appeared from nowhere and carried the 12 people away. The desperate screams of the people would be forever ingrained on the party. "What the fuck just happened?" asked Gramslinger, to no one in particular. Even Elon seemed to be somewhat perturbed by the sight of a small colony of people being carried off by a swarm of rats to their presumed deaths. The party rushed back into the Ark as the heavens opened. "Quick," barked Craig, "get those water collection devices set up. We won't be drinking our piss tonight." "Speak for yourself," an unknown voice in the crowd replied. The people rushed to place the butts and buckets in useful places. "What's more," Craig continued, "is that we've brought back apple seeds. We can plant apple trees." The elder beamed in approval at him. "Well done. I knew you wouldn't let me down." The Ark was full of relief and joy, when suddenly a group of people appeared out of the rain. "Hey," one of them said, "we've got a proposition for you." The party would not hear it, though, as they returned to their quarters in exhaustion, ready to relax and ruminate on their first big adventure into the wastelands. As he lay in his bed that night, Gramslinger struggled to sleep, as he couldn't get the image of the slain dogs out of his mind. He couldn't help but imagine himself as one of the poor creatures. Steve was considering how to improve his underwear mass device. Flora was sulking. Why had the elder thanked Craig when it was her who had found the water butt? As for Craig, he lay there and couldn't get the thought of that big butt out of his mind. Chapter 2. Never trust a man without a horribly embarrassing secret. As night's restful darkness was vanquished by the sickly sunlight of the morning sun, so ended the peaceful slumber of Craig and his crew. They awoke and drifted back to the Ark's main entrance, disturbed by the excited chatter that emanated out to infect the cosy cracks and crevices where they slumbered. The rainfall of the previous night had been collected in the water butts and buckets Elon had dragged back from Han and Lee, leaving the worries of dehydration a now distant memory. Instead, the residents of the Ark were debating whether to plant the bounty of apples the crew had lavished upon them, or to greedily consume them immediately, in celebration of their hero's safe return. "Let us eat them whilst they are ripe," cried Boss Finch. "What use are they all bruised and rotted?" She seemed to speak for those of the Ark who were impatient to satisfy their morning hunger. The elder disagreed with his lieutenant. "We must think of the future," he exclaimed. "If we eat them now, then we might starve tomorrow." What the elder knew, that his more naive followers were unaware of, was that he planned to keep the apples all to himself. Flora had heard of the discourse and waded in with her insightful input. "We can all share the apples, and once we've eaten them, grow new ones from their seed. We can have apples now and in the future." With the rest of the Ark murmuring in approval and awe at Flora's wisdom, the elder silently cursed her name as his selfish scheme lay thwarted. Sensing that she had unknowingly invoked the elder's wrath, Craig laid his hand on Flora's back in an attempt to usher her to the side and give her some sage words of wisdom regarding Ark politics. Yet Flora shuddered upon Craig, feeling Craig's hand on her back. "Don't touch me!" she shrieked. Taken aback, Craig jerked his hand back and consoled himself with the thought that maybe she was not a morning person. Perhaps, he told himself, she was acutely aware that should two Ark members' naked hands touch, then they would be immediately bonded together in matrimony. Maybe, he reasoned, she had a mutated third hand on her back. Feeling hurt and rejected, Craig wandered off from the debate to search out a quiet corner of the Ark and reflect upon his thoughts. He walked past Gramslinger, who had been marking his territory outside a secluded alleyway. "I'm just marking my territory," he squeaked. "Oh, hi, Gramslinger," Craig responded, not even noticing that this half-man, half-dog companion had said or done. "I'm just, heading to the Dawn Vault," Craig said, and the pair walked on in awkward silence. It was some time later when the duo reached the Dawn Vault, where a shocking scene awaited them. The imposing front door was wide open, and slumped in front of it was a Dawn Vault librarian. Craig rushed to the woman's side and used his medical training to assess her condition. "She's not dead," he declared confidently, "though she looks like she ought to be." The woman coughed out, "Thanks." Embarrassed, Craig explained that he had a cold, and that she actually looked quite beautiful now her bruises were showing through a pretty shade of purple. The librarian continued, "He did this to me." "Who? Craig? Gramslinger?" Craig looked at him stony-faced. "I don't know his name. I didn't recognise his face." "He was wearing a balaclava," the librarian explained. Gramslinger quizzed Craig. "Do you have a balaclava?" To which Craig responded by holding his hand over Gramslinger's mouth. The librarian remembered little of their brutal encounter, but assured our heroes that she was tougher than she looked, and promised that she would be fit and recovered before long, ready to work once again with the artefacts held within the vault. Upon mention of the artefacts, she rushed to her feet and darted inside, nearly collapsing in the process. "Everything is still here," she breathlessly exclaimed, except for the noise finder." She proceeded to explain to our heroes what a noise finder was, which to anyone born before 2010 could rather easily tell was clearly a radio. As the year was 2100, however, Gramslinger and Craig struggled to comprehend what the device could be. They returned to the Ark entrance, supporting the librarian between them, and explained to the stunned residents that there was a violent thief in their midst. The sweet taste of fresh apples turned bitter as they chewed over the news of the attack. Discussion immediately turned to who the culprit could be. The finger of suspicion immediately honed in on the psychopaths of the Ark, as the mentally troubled tend to be easy targets for blame in such matters. Yet surprisingly it was Flora who came to their defence. "Whilst they are clearly beings of pure evil, because other people have said it, and therefore it is fact," Flora started, "I personally think that Larry is to blame." Once more the elder cursed Flora's name, as she spat out, "Larry may be a thief, but he's no violent psycho. I'm sure if he was here to defend himself..." His words trailed off as people began to speculate as to where Larry now was. Tim, the resident psychopath, was annoyed but not surprised by Ark's reaction to the attack. He was, however, surprised and heard that Flora had called him evil. He began to regret the kindness he had shown her in sharing his food and supplies with her earlier in the year. The target of the mob's suspicion had now turned to Larry, however, and it was decided that the party of heroes would confront Larry in his abode. Larry lived by himself in a cubicle in the Ark toilets. Larry had unusual tastes. Craig rounded up his posse of Gramslinger, Steve and Flora, who was clearly relishing the prospect of confronting her hated enemy. The elder insisted that Hines, as a loyal and level-headed subordinate, accompany them in their task. A tall, lithe, middle-aged woman, Hines had magnetism, literal magnetism. Her mutation allowed her to attract and repel metal, which was handy in keeping her shotgun steady in her hands. She was a woman of few words. Upon reaching the toilets, they were greeted by a tall, mustachioed man in a green hoodie. He told them, "I'd give it 10 minutes if I were you." The party looked at each other, looked at the man, and then elected to wait a short time before entering the toilets. When they did push open the door, the smell that greeted them was off-putting, though not excessively so for a public toilet. Noticing a balaclava hanging above Larry's cubicle door, Craig led the party to the door and quietly rapped on the door. He cleared his throat and spoke a greeting, but receiving only silence as a reply, Craig ordered Hines to kick down the door. As the cubicle door fell to the ground, the door to the toilet slammed shut. Larry was not in the cubicle and had instead fled the premises. The party burst into the foyer of the Ark and demanded to know where Larry had gone. Upon being informed that he had run through the front door and into the forbidding wastelands, Craig and the others inhaled deeply and sprinted out of the safety of the Ark and into the foul air of the outside world. Spotting Larry in the distance, Steve took off in his direction, with the others following quickly behind him. Having now caught sight of the fleeing suspect, Hines ran out in front, leaving the party trailing in their wake. They ran through the crumbling ruins of Long Tongue. If there were deadly creatures waiting in the shadows, then Larry and his pursuers were too fast for them. Larry had not expected this. He had not envisaged being followed into the wastes. This did not stop him, however, and he ran freely, heading purely on instinct. His ignorance as to the horrors of the wastes gave him the confidence not to fear them as he otherwise should. Hines was fast, but Larry's pure speed had surprised her, leaving Gramslinger to order his dog to take over the pursuit. The dog began to gain on Larry, barking in excitement at the reward his master would provide once he brought his target to a dead halt. Realizing that he could outrun the party, but not their dog, Larry ran out of Long Tongue and was surprised to find water, which gave him an idea. Gramslinger's dog was waiting for the party at the side of the river, barking in frustration at their slow pace. It was apparent that Larry was aware that the dog was tracking his scent and that he had waded into the river to allow him to escape. Fortunately for the party, his trick had backfired, as Larry was unable to swim, leaving the river to overpower him and take him a little way downstream, only to dump him back on the party's side of the river. Now weighed down by wringing wet clothes and exhausted from the chase and his fight with the river, Larry continued to flee. The party, though, soon gained on Larry and seemingly had him in their grasps. Suddenly, a high-pitched shriek pierced the air. It had been reckless for the party, emboldened by their earlier success, to run out into the wastes without showing due caution. Now, horrors beyond their comprehension spied their flesh with envious eyes. Stepping out in front of the party was a giant naked mole-rat. Dumbfounded, the party shielded their eyes at the hideous sight. The mole-rat launched itself at Gramslinger's dog, taking the creature in its jaws. The mole slapped the dog's spine in two. Gramslinger wept openly at the sight of his loyal companion's brutal demise. The rest of the party panicked. They had not reckoned on such a fight. They had rather foolishly only counted on fighting an unarmed Larry. Splat! The mole-rat's head exploded as Hines' shotgun shell reached its target. Hines' quick thinking had saved the party, though had not been quick enough to save the helpless dog. "It took me 2 weeks to train her," Gramslinger wailed, which struck Craig as an extraordinarily quick time to train an animal, and he figured that the dog mutation had given Gramslinger a natural skill in training his kin. As the brief battle concluded, Larry took off and headed back to the ruins of Long Tong. Remembering their mission, the party followed in quick pursuit. Larry dashed down an alleyway, and Hines led the charge after him. A large oil drum crashed into Hines, knocking her to the ground. Larry lunged at Steve, and the two men fell to the ground as they grappled and struggled for supremacy. The rest of the party jumped onto Larry and managed to restrain him, though he fought and kicked and bit his way to freedom. Again, Larry turned on his heels and fled. However, this time he ran straight into an onrushing tide of rats. It was a sight too horrifying to describe. Needless to say, Larry screamed in terror as the Rat King tore him to pieces. If the stream of rats were to turn their way, the party would be done for. As luck would have it, the Rat King rolled away, carrying what remained of Larry with it, and leaving the party unmolested. The radio was also untouched, which Larry had quickly stashed before launching his desperate ambush. Craig picked up the radio and examined it. He pressed a button and a small tape was ejected. What such a thing was, he could only speculate. What reason Larry had for stealing the thing he couldn't fathom, except perhaps for the base instinct of a thief to take what he sensed as valuable. Shaken by their experience, the party collected themselves and returned to the Ark, careful not to disturb any more odious and violent wanderers of the waste. The decayed ruins of Long Tong held no further surprises for them. Craig opened the front door of the Ark and led his troops inside to the cheering congratulations of the waiting crowd. Even the Elder was happy to see them, as he had lost all feelings for Larry the moment his betrayal had become apparent.
Chapter 3. The Gang Explore a Hole. Trinkets and little keepsakes crashed all around Flora as the ground shook. She awoke, terrified and alone, as a deep sound echoed around her living quarters. The sound emanated from beneath her, the vibrations reverberating through her pillow, through her body, seemingly through the whole world. Flora's world was collapsing as her possessions rained down upon her, falling from the shelves and crashing around and upon her once trembling body. Flora shrieked, though nobody was there to hear her above the roar of the earth below. The earthquake lasted for 20 seconds, though to Flora it seemed like hours. She lay on her mattress, bruised and confused, surrounded by a vast array of possessions she had collected during her young life. There were old letters and notes which she could not read, but hoped one day to be able to learn to. The papers were not painful, neither were the empty drink cans that held deep personal meaning to her. However, the rock that she had saved from a recent trip out into the wastes caused her a great deal of pain as it landed on her foot, crushing her little toe. Steve slept blissfully throughout the quake. Craig and Gramslinger, like most others in the Ark, were rattled but not physically hurt during the quake. The whole party, Flora limping slightly, ran out of the quarters and into the chaos of the Ark. Screams and shouting filled the air as residents ran from place to place, checking upon their close friends and family. The voice of the Elder eventually rang out from the centre of the Ark. He was calling his Scavengers, the party, to him. "What happened?" Craig asked of him. The Elder replied, "A sinkhole has opened up under the Ark, and who knows how many people have been dragged into the darkness below. You must save them." A dangerous mission, with no way of knowing what horrors would be waiting under their feet. But the party showed no hesitation in doing their duty and searching for a way down to safely clamber into the giant hole that now dominated the main entrance of the Ark. The Elder insisted that there was no time to waste, but, noticing Flora's bruised foot, Craig insisted that a rope be found to help the rescuers to avoid injury in reaching the bottom of the hole. He was the first to descend the rope, as the more burly men of the Ark held securely to the rope and lowered him down. Gramslinger was next, carrying a new dog in his arms. The dog was not as well trained as his predecessor, and was reluctant to trust his master, though the pair managed to reach the bottom without either of them whimpering excessively. Steve followed them, his eyes closed and his face pale, though he insisted he was not at all scared of heights. Flora then descended, as Craig waited near the bottom to ensure she landed safely. Lastly, Elon made it down the rope with a thud, as the strength of the men above gave way against the incredible weight of the bear man. It soon became apparent that a complex series of rooms and tunnels were now before them. When, or why, they had been constructed, nobody could fathom, but the scale of the task was intimidating to the party, who were already shaken by the experience of the sinkhole's emergence, waking them from their nightly rest. "Help!" a voice cried out. Steve faced the torch in the direction of the sound, and the party walked forwards in search of survivors. They entered another room, which split off into 3 passageways, and continued to follow the voice down the rightmost passage. A tall, curly-haired, middle-aged-looking woman greeted them. "My saviours!" she cried. "Don't mention it, old dear," Craig said. "Old? I'm only 18, said the woman. "And my name is Eve, by the way." Craig blushed and stated, "I'm sorry, I have a cold." Flora guided the poor woman back to the entrance, confident in her ability to find her way back to the group using the map Craig had sketched out for her. It was half an hour later when Flora returned to the group. "What the hell took you so long?" asked Craig suspiciously. Flora explained that she had got lost on the way back due to the poor quality of the map provided. "It's the worst map I've ever seen. It's so bad," she claimed. "I'll draw the map from now on. I'm quite skilled at map making." "You guys shut up." Trusting his friend's word that she had not overestimated her own cartography skills, Craig assigned Flora to map-making duties, and the party moved on to the next chamber. With no further voices to guide them, the party feared that Eve would be the only survivor they would find. They nonetheless continued further into the catacombs and came across a pool of dank water. Elon thought that only an idiot would consider drinking from such a disgusting pool of stagnant water. "You should drink the water," Gramslinger said to Steve. "Okay," Steve replied as he knelt down at the pool and, to the horror of the party, took a big gulp of water and swallowed it down. He then smirked back at them and said, "This delicious dank water is no trouble for my strong constitution." Little did he realize, however, that tiny gutfish called home to the water, and now a small colony of fish had taken up residence in his stomach. Repulsed by what she had seen, Flora rushed ahead to the next chamber. There she found what old worlders would call a magazine. The magazine was filled with pictures of mostly naked men and women getting along famously. "Now I really am going to be sick," she shrieked as she sprinted back to rejoin the party at the water chamber. "Did you find anything?" Craig asked, only to be bemused by Flora's determination that nothing of interest lay in the chamber she had just fled from. Yet a small figure emerged from where Flora had fled from. "Are you with the rescue party?" inquired the man. "Nothing of interest?" Craig asked pointedly. Flora looked ashamed as she offered to take the man back to the surface. Now armed with a map of her own creation, it took Flora nearly 2 hours to make it back to the party. Upon closer inspection, the map revealed her Flora's questionable geography skills. The dimensions and scale of the map was completely wrong and was of no use whatsoever. She refused to countenance the idea that her map-making skills were subpar, and instead blamed her bruised foot for the slowness of her return. "I don't need you guys. I don't need your help. I don't need anybody," she shouted, turning on her heels to run away to what would likely be her cold and lonely death in the depths of the catacombs. Flora, however, did not flee. Instead, she tripped and stumbled towards the stagnant fish water. Craig acted instinctively and reached out his hand to steady her and grasped tightly to what was in front of him. What he had in his hand was small but firm. The rest of the party gasped. "You're touching her sacred area," Gramslinger's voice trembled as he spoke. "According to the laws of the Ark, your punishment is clear." Craig panicked as he rambled. "I didn't mean to. They're so tiny. What are the chances? It was an accident. It was an emergency. Surely not." Elon's voice boomed out. "Yes, Craig and Flora have touched hands. The law is clear. They are now legally married." It took several minutes of crying before Flora managed to compose herself. "That's meant to be my punishment, you know. I don't know what you're crying for," Craig said to her. Flora blurted out, "I'm gay." The party stood in shocked silence at the revelation. It was Steve who broke the silence. "Well, cheer up. It's not like any woman would ever be interested in you." Flora stood up, her eyebrows knitted together in frustration at both the comment and the situation. "Shut up," she said in response. Suddenly, another survivor emerged from out of the darkness. Clearly frightened, the relief in the young man's voice reminded the party of their mission. The joys of married life would have to wait until all the survivors were rescued. With Elon volunteering to guide the woman back to the sinkhole entrance, it was decided that the party would continue to advance into the tunnels in search of further survivors. Elon was confident that his sense of direction was stronger than Flora's. Gramslinger set his dog to the task of sniffing out their route, and it was agreed to leave a trail of breadcrumbs to lead Elon back to them. 3 further passageways were explored without incident as the group delved deeper into the caverns. To put it rather mildly, it came as a surprise for the party to find Elon waiting for them deep in the caverns. The bear man explained that he had explored an alternative passageway after guiding the survivors back to the entrance, and that they had in fact travelled in a big circle. Craig began to regret letting Flora draw the map, as he was now more confused than ever. "Let's just keep exploring and looking for survivors," he told the others. An injured grazer awaited in the next chamber, apparently having fallen from the surface above. The party sneaked past it, unwilling either to risk combat or claim glory in felling a wounded creature. They noticed that it lay resting next to a giant machine. The machine was bright yellow and had a bright claw on the front, like a mechanical elephant. They noted the location and continued searching. "Sydney, shut up!" By now Steve had begun to feel quite ill. He groaned and held his stomach. The others felt little sympathy for him, though Gramslinger felt more than a little guilty. Gramslinger's new dog began finally to show her usefulness as she picked up the scent of another survivor and guided her master down 2 further passageways. Gramslinger found the stricken older lady, by now barely conscious, and brought her back to Elon. Elon placed the woman on his back and marched off to the entrance, whilst the woman mumbled her gratitude. The search for further survivors continued as the party scrambled down a slope to the next area. Steve, still holding his stomach, slipped and stumbled down the slope, injuring his leg in the process. Craig supported Steve into the next chamber, whilst Flora's own toe injury was beginning to cause her pain. "We can't go on much longer," she said. "We've probably rescued everyone who's still alive." The others agreed, though Craig insisted that they continue for another 30 minutes, just to make sure no one was left behind. Onward they went, scrambling up a slope with great difficulty due to Flora and Steve's injuries. At this stage, Gramslinger's dog began to bark and bounded off to yet another trapped and wounded Ark resident. "I'd almost given up hope," the man exclaimed, as Gramslinger guided him to the others. With the injuries and the fatigue beginning to take their toll, the group decided to return home. It seemed unlikely that anyone would have ventured much further in search of safety. The group encountered Elon as they retraced their steps. He told them that he had heard strange things being discussed from the surface. "There's talk of mandatory labour for residents," he said. Craig dismissed such speculation, though Flora did point out that if slaves were to be used, then it would be very good for those who weren't slaves, as all the dangerous and hard work could be done by the slaves. The party discussed the topic as they journeyed back to the entrance of the sinkhole. The moral implications were barely mentioned, with the focus of the discussions being purely centred on the practicalities of such a system. All that they could agree for certain was that they would not allow any of the party to be assigned to slave duty. As Craig was lifted up to safety, with Steve and Flora already being guided away to treatment, the residents of the Ark gave out a loud cheer. Their heroes had returned. The elder put his arm around Craig and told him, "Excellent work there, my friend. You've saved everyone who was down there." He went on to announce the plans to fill up the hole and to secure the foundations of the Ark, but explained this would require some indentured servitude from some residents. Craig pondered on the statement and asked who in the Ark would be required to perform such labour. The elder began to quietly list off names, with Craig silently nodding to each other. The name of Flora was mentioned, but Craig spoke out against the suggestion. The elder, sensing he would not convince his young friend otherwise, agreed to remove her name from the list of slaves. This brought to an end a dark chapter in the history of the Ark, though the future would be darker still. Chapter 4. Jolly Old St. Nick, Part 1. It seemed like a fair compromise. Those who had a moral objection to using slave labour were given the option to instead become a slave themselves. It was strange that most of the objections to slavery melted away after the elder made this pronouncement. As few in the Ark had volunteered to be slaves, in fact only a tiny majority put their names forward for the forced labour scheme. It was decided that the slave population would mainly consist of people found wandering the wastes. It was entirely possible that these as yet unmet people would be opposed to the idea. Unfortunately for them, however, the opinion of slaves counted for naught in the Ark. As the delegation of the other Ark had arrived before it was decided that slavery was the way forward, they were excused from slave labour duty, much to their relief. It had already proved to have been an awkward encounter before the slavery discussion, as both the people of the Ark and the delegation referred to their own home as the Ark. Thus, to eliminate confusion, it was decided that the delegation's home would be referred to as the other Ark. The other Ark's delegation had consisted of 2 young boys, and it had seemed unjust to force them into slavery when they had managed to survive the horrors of the wastes in order to complete their mission of finding nearby colonies to trade with. The boys were allowed to leave after detailing directions as to the location of the other Ark. Flora took notes. Fortunately, so did party members with a functioning sense of direction. Cara was the guest party member that the elder had assigned to them during their trade mission. A stocky, well-built and middle-aged woman, Cara was a survivor. She had mutated frog legs rather than the standard human legs that most people were born with. Craig sensed that these frog legs would give her an advantage in combat, though he hoped that he would not need to find out. Cara knew the wastes better than most, and had travelled further than anyone else on the Ark. She was a sensible choice for this mission, which was to be considered no less dangerous just because 2 young boys had completed it just 2 days earlier. Craig reasoned that maybe hundreds of boys had been dispatched, and that those 2 could be the only survivors. Craig led the party out of the Ark as the residents cheered and shouted words of encouragement. The residents looked bright and hopeful at the prospect of finding another colony to trade and converse with. Even the slaves were hopeful, though they were wishing for the other Ark to be filled with vicious killers who would attack the Ark and free those assigned to permanent, unpaid internships. The party walked for 20 minutes through the desolate ruins that surrounded the Ark, seeing nothing and hearing nothing. The silence was rather foreboding. Steve pondered, though he much preferred an eerie quiet to the sound of thousands of scurrying rat feet. After some time, a tinkering sound was heard. Rather than being deafening or unnerving, it was instead a rather irritating noise. Dink, dink, dink. Cara, despite her great experience, had no clue what could be making such a din. Gramslinger set his dog on the case, and it soon found the cause of the noise. The dog's incessant barking was a much more pleasant sound than that of the tinkering. The dog was standing out of a small building, and, having heard just about enough of the noise, Craig burst through the building's front door to confront the source of the sound. "Ah, you must be the one foretold in the shavings," a small, eccentric-looking gentleman exclaimed. "What?" Craig replied. "The shavings. They foretold it," said the gentleman. "What?" Craig repeated. At this moment, Flora walked through the door. "Ah, you too were foretold," the gentleman told her. "What?" Flora replied. "Here, a flower for the lady," said the gentleman. Craig started. "Do you mind? That's my wife." Flora let out a shriek that cut Craig off mid-sentence. "A flower!" she bellowed. The gentleman began to speak again. "Yes, indeed, my lady. Now, would you like me to tell you your future?" Craig sighed, sensing that their long and dangerous mission had quickly become even longer and more dangerously annoying. Flora was sat cross-legged in front of the man. "Who are you?" Craig inquired of him. "I am the Oracle," claimed the Oracle. Craig grunted. "Of course you are." Flora glared at her husband. "I'm trying to have my future foretold, if you don't mind." The Oracle began. I foretell a difficult marriage." Craig left the building, not wishing to hear any more of the Oracle and his proclamations. The rest of the party were keen to hear what mysterious things he had seen in there, but he was in no mood to retell the tale. Flora joined the rest of the party outside after 5 minutes. She looked like she was deep in thought. Steve was worried by such an unusual sight. "Aren't you feeling well?" he asked her. Flora told him that the Oracle had predicted that she would be struck down with a terrible illness. Craig scoffed. "What a load of old rubbish. Don't go listening to that moron. Steve was confused. You mean that Flora hasn't been speaking with the Oracle? Craig rolled his eyes. What I mean is that there ain't no such thing as a fortune teller. I mean, come on, it's scientifically impossible. Gramslinger wagged his tail in agreement, and Kara stretched her frog legs as she murmured something about the time. Flora decided not to dwell on the prediction and to instead focus on the task at hand. Kara informed the others that she sensed danger and advised them to stick close behind her and to try to avoid making unnecessary noise. Gramslinger looked nervous, silently cursing that he ate a chocolate bar earlier in the journey. Chocolate always gave him wind. Kara crept over the marshes that lay next to Long Tongue. It seemed as if someone or something was watching them. Yet they passed through the marshlands without incident and reached more crumbling ruins. Before the apocalypse, the city of Stoke had many crumbling ruins, though had slightly fewer mutants. As the party trudged through the ruins of Stoke, trampling over weeds and stumbling over cracked pavements, they noticed the temperature slowly plummet. It had been fair and bright today before now, but clouds filled the sky and conditions became positively arctic. Gramslinger noticed that tiny drops of snow were falling from the sky, though he scarcely believed his eyes, as he knew that snow could never fall during the warmer season. Yet the sky indeed began to fill with snowflakes, whilst the party shivered and divered in the freezing cold. A chill went down Craig's spine as he thought of the young boys. Had they really made it all this way in such grim conditions? What would they find at the other ark? Would Flora really fall ill? Snow covered the ground as the party reached their destination. A large dome-like building came into view, which from the description the boys had given seemed to be the other ark. Smoke was billowing out of a chimney towards the rear of the structure, giving the party hope that warmer temperatures lay inside. Craig marched up to the front door of the building and knocked loudly. The others huddled around him, fearing an icy death more than the unknown of the other ark. Suddenly the door swung violently open, nearly smacking into Craig in the process. What was standing in the doorway to greet the party shocked them to the core. A young woman, tall and slender, with flowing raven-black hair that curled around a face of outstanding beauty. Her doe eyes were a deep brown, her lips were ruby red, and her horns were nubile and delicate, for she, like all humans, was a mutant. Her mutation only accentuated her natural beauty. She was a captivating sight to behold. The beauty spoke. "Come in. My father has been expecting you." All four of the party were in awe at the reindeer girl's beauty, leaving only Kara to step forward into the other ark. As if breaking free from a trance, Steve stepped forward and greeted the girl. The others also entered the other ark and acknowledged her. She told them her name was Rose and that she had been assigned as their guide. Rose led them into a hallway, showed them a bathroom area, and explained that she would lead on once they were ready. Having freshened themselves up, the party stood around Rose. Craig told her to lead on. Rose gave a slight bow, and he watched as her long legs set into motion towards a grand-looking set of double doors. She knew how to use those legs, he thought. Gramslinger, using his mind powers to read Craig's thoughts, said, "Doesn't everyone know how to use their legs?" The question baffled everyone, though no one wished to engage with it, and the party instead followed Rose into the next room. What awaited them behind the double doors they could never have fathomed. They stepped into a very large room filled with men and machinery. On closer inspection, the machinery seemed to form some sort of primitive assembly line, in which many different small products and toys were being constructed. Instead of being men, the workers instead appeared to be small children with pointed ears and identical green uniforms. Rose did not explain the purpose of the room or its contents, and simply walked past all the inhabitants towards another grand-looking door. Not wishing to appear rude or ignorant, the party followed her through the door and into yet another room. This new room was rather smaller and less unusual than the assembly room, save for a large evergreen tree that had been planted in one corner. Having brought them to their destination, Rose excused herself and informed them that the overseer would see them in the next 10 minutes. The overseer, she informed them, was the leader of the other ark and would be happy to answer any questions they may have and negotiate any trade deals. She then left the room, leaving the party to discuss among themselves the sights they had seen. The first topic on the agenda was Rose's stunning beauty. Craig commented that her face was the loveliest he had ever seen, though he quickly corrected himself that she was second in beauty only to Flora. Steve said that Rose's legs were extremely appealing. Gramslinger added that her horns were very pretty. Flora simply said, "She has a nice arse," though the others felt that such a comment was rather crude. The topic of the workshop and the little workers, or of the peculiar weather phenomenon, or the terms of any trade deal were not discussed. The debate over Rose's finer points were brought to an immediate halt as the grand door burst open. In stepped a huge, hulking figure of a man. The man had girth, he had terrible skin, and he had white hair covering most of his features. "Ho, ho, how do you do?" he stuttered. "I am the observer. Please make yourselves at home." He pulled back a curtain that no one in the party had noticed, and showed them to a black leather couch. "Please sit down," he implored of them. Craig, Gramslinger, Flora, Steve, and Cara sat themselves on the couch, making it something of a tight squeeze. A woman then entered the room. She was an older woman, with white hair and sensible clothing, and she was carrying a tray of what appeared to be cookies. "This is my wife, Mrs. Overseer," the overseer explained as he motioned for them to try the cookies. Aside from Cara, who claimed to be not feeling hungry, the rest of the greedy party members took him to the tasty snacks as he began a lengthy speech detailing the workings of the other ark. He said that the mission of the other ark was to create high-quality toys, and that he was happy for Rose to give them a full tour, at which point he left the room, but not before insisting that they take a further tray of cookies home with them. He left the room and Rose re-entered, though the overseer popped his head round the door to say, "Oh, and don't forget, my sweet Rosie, do not let them enter the private rooms." With the party's stomachs and rucksacks now filled with delicious cookies, they were happy to follow the beautiful Rose around on their tour of the facilities. She showed them the living quarters and the relaxation room, though insisted that they not go through any doors without her express permission. Cara felt uneasy and suspicious at the instructions, however, and whilst Rose was distracted, she slipped away into a room marked "Private" on the front. Inside she found a large bed with straps and chains on it. She looked around and saw many bizarre and dangerous-looking items and equipment, none of which seemed to be for the purpose of building toys. The ceiling of the room was dominated by a huge mirror. Everything in the room made Cara shudder. She looked in the corner of the room and saw the overseer, completely naked, standing over a girl who looked very similar to Rose. Neither the girl nor the overseer had noticed Cara as they were busy doing something. The overseer had a large whip in his hand and was covered in some sort of leather. The girl was moaning softly, saying, "Harder, Daddy." Cara wasn't quite sure what she had seen, but knew it was time to leave. Cara quietly exited the room and returned to the hallway. With Rose seemingly oblivious to her absence, Cara continued into another room marked "Private." She slowly opened the door, not wishing to draw the attention of whomever or whatever was inside. What she saw was a horror beyond almost Victor. What she saw was a horror almost beyond her comprehension. Inside was a large metal machine. It consisted of large spinning blades, and with this particular assembly line was producing chilled her very soul. She witnessed a large, hideous young man with awful skin and the wispiest of facial hair. This hideous creature was dangling a small elf boy over the machine. He let go and dropped the boy into the machine. Within a second the blades had decimated the boy and blended him into a liquid ooze. The ooze seeped out into a container. Cara saw the accompanying kitchen and instantly realized what was going on. The cookies her friends had eaten were made from children. Cara quietly said, "Okay then," and slowly backed out of the room. Steve was munching on a delicious cookie as Cara returned to the party, who seemed to be missing their tour guide. Cara smacked the treat out of his hand. "Those cookies are people," she hissed. It took several minutes for her to explain what she was talking about, and for the party to comprehend what she was saying. By this time Rose had returned, and had heard much of what had been said. She coughed politely, startling the party. Craig asked of her, "Did you know that boys are slaughtered when they reach puberty, and their remains are fed to the others?" Rose replied that she was aware, yes. Flora interrupted, "Do you know the flavourings Mrs. Overseer uses, because these cookies are delicious?" The rest of the party agreed, and decided that the cookie recipe would be one of the items they would bargain for in the trade agreement. Cara was shocked by the lack of shock the party were showing. "But the cannibalism," she blurted out. Her companions looked at her in bemusement. Craig then turned to Rose and asked, "Are all youngsters ground into food?" Rose laughed at the question and said, "Of course not. Only the boys are slaughtered. The girls, once they become of age, marry the overseer and become breeders for the other ark." Silence filled the air. The thought of the monstrous old overseer devouring all those young girls, his own daughters, made them all feel very unnerved and aroused. Craig brought his friends into a huddle and asked for their opinions. Nobody was bothered by the incest and cannibalism of the overseer. However, they felt that Rose was too beautiful and pure a creature to be defiled by the monster. It was at this moment that a bell in the corner started to ring. The party was startled, but Rose assured them that it was nothing to worry about. It was simply the overseer calling for his reindeer to return to him in his private chambers. Rose said that she would be required to report there for the first time tomorrow, but for now she was at the party's service. Craig agreed with the group that Rose should not have to be forced into mating with her hideous father. He approached Rose and whispered in her ear, "If you wish to avoid such a fate, meet us at the front door." She was startled, looked curiously into Craig's eyes, gently touched his handsome face, and fled from the room. Steve's stomach began to grumble, much to the alarm of the other party members. However, remembering the incident of the gutfish water, they were reassured that the cookies provided by the overseer were not dangerous, at least not to those eating them. Steve aside, the party felt comfortable and relaxed, though tired from their long journey across the waste. It was decided that they would rest and catch up on their sleep. Trade discussions could wait until the morning. They sought out Mrs. Overseer, and the kindly old lady showed them to some unoccupied bedchambers where they could call their own for the night. Chapter 5. Jolly Old St. Nick, Part 2. The night passed without incident, allowing the party a full night of rest. Even Steve managed to sleep despite his increasing stomach pains. Flora commented that the high-pitched screams that seeped through the walls helped her to drift off to sleep, and were quite relaxing. Craig added that it was a shame that they could not stay longer, but their duty was to the Ark. "Which one?" Steve asked. "Not the other Ark, our Ark," Craig clarified. It was Mrs. Overseer who knocked on their door in the morning, with Rose seemingly nowhere in sight. Mrs. Overseer informed them that her husband would see them now in the grotto to discuss the terms of their trade deal, and the party followed her to the room where they had initially met the overseer. With a plate of cookies helping to keep the party satisfied, they waited in the grotto for the overseer to return. He stepped into the room, bid them a good morning, and then buckled up his belt and zipped up his fly, coughing to excuse his embarrassment at not having done so before he had entered. "A busy night?" Craig asked his host. The overseer explained that it had been a long and hard night, as he had been filling his children with discipline, among other things. The party agreed that discipline was important. Flora spoke up and asked him the question that the party had been dying to ask of him. "Where do you get your children from?" The overseer laughed heartily and pointed at his crotch, and then motioned at Mrs. Overseer's belly. "They go from here and come out there," he said. The party sat in bafflement for some time. It was Gramslinger who spoke first. "But I've done that quite a few times, and no children ever appeared." Steve, now feeling quite sick, said that maybe you have to do it with another human and not your dog. Gramslinger clarified that he had been referring to things he had done with women of the Ark. Cara spoke out in agreement, saying that many couples had tried such things, and their Ark had never yet produced one single child. Now it was the overseer's time to be confused. "Well, you must have been born somehow, had childhoods and grown up. Don't you remember?" Flora explained that she had never had a childhood. Her first memory was waking up as an adult only some months previously, and being welcomed by the others of the Ark. Craig confirmed her story, saying that this is how all Ark residents came to live in the Ark, except those that had wandered in from the wastes, though equally they had never known anything other than an adult life. It was the overseer's time to stroke his white beard in amazement. "So," he finally started, "you don't have any boys to do your labour, then?" Craig told him that the Ark had recently started an indentured servitude program, but that thus far there were only a few who had signed up for it. The overseer clasped his hands together and shouted, "Well, I can fix that. I can provide you with slaves for my sons that are too old to labour in the workshop, and you can provide us with food. I am sick of eating these damn cookies all day." It seemed a good deal. However, Craig pondered for a moment and said, "Well, what of your daughters? You could trade them too." The overseer's face darkened. "No," he stated. "My daughters are mine, and mine alone." The party looked at each other, exchanging knowing looks of acknowledgement. They had heard enough. It was time to act. Craig jumped to his feet and thrust out his hand. "Put it there, my friend. You have a deal." The overseer grinned an evil grin and shook Craig's hand. "A pleasure doing business with you." The rest of the party also rose to their feet, and each picked up a glass of celebratory drinks that a now beaming Mrs. Overseer had shoved under their noses. The overseer slowly raised himself, picked up a glass, and proposed a toast. "Gentlemen, to evil." The party raised their glasses and cried out, "To evil." Discussions continued as to the logistics of the trade deal before the party headed for the exit, content in the knowledge that they had accomplished their mission. A grinning Mrs. Overseer called for the eldest of her reindeer daughters, the lovely Rose. The elegant Rose stepped into the grotto, grabbing the immediate attention of the party, who were still in awe at her stunning beauty. Mrs. Overseer told her, "Please show our guests to the front door. This will be the last of your childhood duties, before you begin your new life in servitude of your father, until, of course, the day when your youthful beauty fades and you are relieved of such duty, and you become a part of all of us." The overseer smirked at his wife's speech as his hands disappeared down his trousers. The party silently followed Rose through the workshop, past the slaving boys, to the other Ark's front door. They stepped outside, and Craig turned round to face Rose, telling her, "Now is your chance, sweet Rose. You may leave with us and be free of your father's evil machinations." Rose scoffed at his words. "What, are you kidding? I can't bloody well wait to start my new duty." She slammed the door in Craig's face, leaving him standing in the cold morning light with Flora, Gramslinger, Steve, and Cara. Craig shrugged his shoulders and smiled as he looked at his wife Flora. "Let's go home," he told them. Cara looked at the snow-filled clouds above them and proposed that they follow the sun, trying to find a less inhospitable route home. With Flora already starting to shiver, despite her refusing to put a coat on, it was agreed that a less chilly path home would be preferable. Cara marched forwards, guiding the party through the crumbling ruins of what the overseer had informed them was the area known as Tree Evil. It took some 30 minutes for them to leave the snow-filled ruins and find land that was untouched by the virgin snow. No longer feeling the cold, the party became aware that the biggest threat that faced them now was not the weather, but the beasts that roamed the wastes. With Cara's instinct protecting them from stumbling upon any deadly creatures, they traversed ruins overgrown with vegetation and reached an area that was filled with deadly rot. They marched onward through the ruins, coughing and spluttering as the rot filled their lungs. Steve was resistant to the rot, but his immune system had been weakened by the gutfish growing inside of him, leaving him just as vulnerable as the others. Steve put his underwear back over his head, Cara put her scarf over her mouth, and Craig lent his gas mask to Flora to use. The others had to endure the poisonous rot without any protection. Eventually the rot cleared, and the party were able to breathe fresh air once again. Cara spent the next several hours carefully guiding them through the ruins and deadwood of Stoke's central areas. It was difficult and at times painful walking, but they managed to safely reach Long Tongue. With the Ark now in sight, a family of waste wanderers appeared. They seemed strong and healthy. They would make excellent slaves. Gramslinger called out to the family, "Hey, would you like to be slaves?" Flora elbowed him in the ribs as the family's patriarch turned around and shouted back. "What?" Flora's shrill voice called out, "Nothing. We're just asking if you'd like to join us at our Ark. We can offer you safety and food." The man's face opened up into a big smile. He motioned to his wife and teenage daughters to follow him towards Flora and the promises she made. Suddenly, a great swarm of rats appeared from nowhere and immediately enveloped the family, carrying the screaming offspring away into the sewers. The woman's agonized screams were traumatizing to the ear as the rats ripped apart her flesh. Within only minutes, the whole family had disappeared amid the swarm of rats and down into the sewers, leaving only blood behind. Steve commented, "This keeps happening." Craig replied, "Yes, it's really annoying." The party walked on and reached the safety of the Ark, just as night was falling. Craig held open the front door of the Ark as his party walked inside. The residents of the Ark quickly gathered around them and began to pepper them with questions. Boss Marlett pushed her way past the crowd, and her voice boomed out, "Come now, let our heroes have some room. Now, instead of overwhelming them with questions, why don't we show them what we have been working on in their absence?" The slaves were angry that Marlett had used the term "we" to describe what had been their labour alone, but they knew it would not be wise to voice their frustration. Marlett pointed outside the front windows to show a small stump. "What does it do?" Gramslinger asked. Marlett beamed. "It's a sundial," she informed him. "We can use it to keep the time and ensure the slaves are working hard enough." The slaves were once again angered by her words, but their spirits were broken, and they knew that complaining was not in their best interests. The party agreed that the sundial was a very fine-looking invention. Steve was particularly impressed, and the invention briefly distracted him from the thoughts of his hunger pains and stomach irritations from the equally hungry gutfish. The elder, showing his age, limped towards them and dismissed their concerns of his health, and he inquired only of their success, or lack of, in foraging a trade deal with the other Ark. Flora proudly reported of the terms of their trade, and the Ark residents were delighted to hear that they would soon be given new slaves who could be put to work building new projects to improve the Ark. Flora continued to talk, explaining the tale of how the party had reached the other Ark, and she told them of the sickening wonders of the Overseer. Craig noticed that Flora tended to exaggerate her own involvement in the story and embellish many of the details, though he did not correct her, as she told of how the beautiful Rose had fallen in love with her, but was prevented to leave out of a sense of duty to her father. The party shared out the cookies they had brought back with them and surprised the residents by explaining that the secret ingredient was human flesh. Steve boldly stated that he thought the Ark should take up cannibalism themselves. The Ark was divided over the issue, however, and the old elder ultimately disagreed, saying that he did not think it was a healthy food source and that the long-term health effects were not yet known. Craig excitedly gave a graphic account of the Overseer's private rooms, explaining how he was able to produce children. Flora had been too embarrassed to talk of such things, and excused herself while her husband started to talk of what the Overseer put where, and who with, and how many times. The residents were amazed, as many had not realized that such enjoyable activities could produce children. Much debate ensued as to why the Overseer was able to produce children. Perhaps only a father and his child would produce more children, the elder theorized, though this raised the question of how could a child be produced if there were no fathers to begin with, a chicken and egg situation. In the end, most concluded that the Overseer must have mutant abilities. Whatever the case, the whole party agreed that the Overseer had been a thoroughly nice man, and they were confident that the other Ark would prove to be fine allies. Chapter 6. An Unwanted Facial. Boss Marlett was on the warpath. Her hands were sore from whipping, her voice hoarse from screaming, and her blood pressure was through the roof. The slaves were also tired of the whipping, screaming, and bleeding. There was little to be done, though. The elder ordered Marlett to go to bed and to give the slaves a rest. There was no progress being made on the mill project. It was a fabulous idea, a way for the Ark to grind corn and produce better quality food. However, there was simply no wood coming down from the north to provide the raw materials needed for the project. There were rumours flying around the Ark as to why the logging team had stopped sending their woods from the forests of the north. It was known that Eli had been complaining about the tough working conditions and the dangers involved in working outside the safety of the Ark. Yet the elder had ignored his concerns. Still, there had been nobody from the logging team that had come to report any problems. The elder was worried, not least because the delay was holding up the mill project. The people of the Ark worked fast and adapted quickly to new technological advances. The sundial allowed to greater working efficiencies, the apples from the apple trees were nutritious and healthy, and the slaves provided by the Overseer worked quietly and efficiently. Those with logical minds were methodically planning and experimenting with the artefacts that had been recovered. There was confidence that in the near future the Ark's best and brightest might find a use for the radio, though it was felt further technological advances were needed. Whilst the nerds worked at the radio, many of the other Ark residents were trying to figure out how the Overseer managed to get his daughter girlfriends into the family way, so to speak. Though they weren't making much progress, they were having a great deal of fun with their experiments. For the first time that she could remember, Flora woke up in her quarters feeling happy and content. As a hero of the Ark, she was allowed more space and amenities. As her husband was also a hero of the work, it meant that the quarters they shared together were larger and more luxurious than even the Elder's accommodation. Flora wondered where Craig was, and debated with herself whether to go and look for him. She looked around at her room, which was filled with trinkets and memories, but also kept tidy and clean thanks to her husband. She felt cosy and safe there in the darkness. Craig would return soon enough, she thought. She decided that she would stay in bed. After all, there was nowhere else she'd rather be. Craig, Gramslinger and Steve were gathered outside the Elder's private quarters, as they had been ordered to. All 4 heroes had been ordered to report there, though Craig explained that he felt Flora would benefit from catching up on her sleep. The Elder told them of the situation, which most of the residents were already well aware of, but then began to whisper in hushed tones about conspiracy. He suspected that Eli, leader of the logging committee, was up to no good. Eli was ambitious and had few friends outside of the men under his command. Steve asked what they were to do. The Elder gave them their orders. They were to investigate the logging station and bring it back into working order, killing Eli if necessary. The men exchanged looks of grim determination. They knew their mission was a dangerous one, and that they may end the day by killing a powerful man. Steve, Gramslinger and Craig discussed their plan of action. Firstly, they decided that they would need the toughest guy in the Ark to support them on their mission, Elvis. This seemed a wise decision. After all, his mutation gave him crocodile skin and a huge amount of strength, not to mention his natural mean streak and love of brawling. Yet they had not accounted for one added complication. Elvis was a good friend of Eli's and saw him as the Ark's next leader-in-waiting. Flora was wakened from her sleep by the gentle kicking of her husband as he softly pommeled her ribcage with his size 11 Doc Martens. "Time to get up, my sweet," he cooed, throwing her formal rags over her head. "We have an important and dangerous mission," he began to report, ending with the explanation that Elvis would be accompanying them on the trip, so they would have nothing to worry about if violence did break out. Flora was greatly frustrated at being left out of the mission briefing with the Elder. She worried that the party would next be going on missions without her, leaving her abandoned and alone. She felt agitated, low on self-esteem, and short on confidence. "Stop being such a stupid moron," Craig told her. "I would never leave you." Flora was not convinced. "Well, what about that Rose from the other Ark? You seemed very keen to get her back here." Craig had no answer to this, other than to say, "I haven't got time to reassure you. Now put your rags on, you great nit." It was some 20 minutes into their journey, with the Ark fading from view behind them, that Craig explained the mission to Elvis. He and Flora had not been on speaking terms, creating an air of tension in the group. The reaction of Elvis to the news did little to relax the group, though the party did start to become less concerned about Craig and Flora's domestic tiff. Elvis was devastated to hear that the logging team had not reported it. He told the party that Eli was the Ark's great saviour, and that they must all hurry forwards to rescue Eli and his men. Steve, not sensing the tone, said, "We'll probably have to kill Eli because he's turned against the Ark." Flora smacked her forehead with her hand, whilst Craig and Gramslinger both gulped. Eli turned to Steve and yellowed, "What?" The theory that Eli had turned against the Ark did not go down well with Elvis. He insisted that Eli would not do such a thing, and that the Elder must be mad to suspect such a loyal and brilliant man such as Eli. Craig explained that hopefully there was some reasonable explanation for the logging team's silence, but that if it came to it, then Elvis must be prepared to take him down. Elvis stated that, "My loyalty is to the Ark, but so is Eli's. I'm sure it must be some kind of mix-up." That would have to do for now, Craig sensed, knowing that Elvis still believed in Eli. More crumbling ruins lay between the Ark and its northern logging station, which lay to the southwest of Avonlea. The party trudged on in silence following their discussion. That silence was eventually broken by a curious sound, which gradually became a deafening roar. Steve broke off from the others to spy through a burnt-out building at the site in the eastern fields that amazed and captivated him. The roar was coming from a hell driver, a huge mechanical construct of spikes and flames. Who was controlling the machine, Steve could not tell, but what the hell driver was fighting was impossible to miss. Dozens of giant spiders were throwing themselves at the machine, impaling themselves on the spikes as they spat acid towards the driver. Craig and the others soon joined Steve in the building, and were equally astounded by the spectacle. Gramslinger noticed that the hell driver was not alone, and that in fact there were several other hell drivers further to the east. Each of these constructs were fighting a spider battle of their own. This was not a lone battle, but an all-out war between species. Steve went to jump down and join in the fight, but was dragged back by Flora. "Are you crazy?" she hissed. "You can't fight them. You'll be killed. And what for? None of them are our enemies." The disappointment on Steve's face was obvious, though he accepted the reason in her words. Gramslinger begged Craig to let them stay and watch the fighting, but reluctantly accepted that they had a mission to do, and that spectacle would have to wait. As the party continued their journey northwards, the stench of rot in the air became almost overpowering. The usual countermeasures were deployed, though this time both Gramslinger and Craig had masks that had been fashioned by Steve. Flora, looking down her nose through her gas mask at her teammates. "Why are you wearing your underwear over your heads?" she inquired. Craig felt it best not to correct her by pointing out that it was not his own underwear he was wearing, and instead let Steve explain the effectiveness of the invention. Steve was quick to reassure Flora that Gramslinger and Craig had provided the underwear, leaving him merely to form the pants and panties into effective mask filters. He asked Flora if she wished for him to make one for her. She did not. It was a beautiful area that lay to the south of the Ark's lumberyard. Acres of glassified fields shone brightly in the afternoon sun, almost blinding the party at times. It gave the area a sense of unreality, with nature seemingly breaking the laws of physics to produce a delicate surface for that party to carefully navigate. How felled trees were transported back to the Ark through this route was something that none of the party considered. They already had enough on their minds thinking of the upcoming confrontation. Had the party been able to check the sundial back at the Ark, they would have discovered that they had reached the lumberyard at around 2 in the afternoon. The yard was quiet still, in contrast to the noise and bustle of a standard working day. There was no sign of struggle as they entered through the large, imposing gates that lay open at the front of the yard. However, once inside, they discovered what had happened to Eli and his men. Placed strategically around the lumberyard, armed with clubs and other melee weapons, were Eli's men. They made for an intimidating fight, though not as intimidating as Elvis, the half-man, half-crocodile. The mere sight of the monster made the lumberjacks nervous, despite their superior numbers. "Where is Eli?" roared Elvis. It was then that Eli made his presence known, as he stepped onto the large threshing machine in the middle of the yard. "Here I am, old friend," he said, trying to sound confident as he clutched a vial of deadly sap poison. Should he be attacked, then the aggressor would find themselves with a nasty surprise. Elvis went to run towards the threshing machine, only to find Flora pulling at his right arm. "Wait," she pleaded. "Don't you see it's a trap?" Elvis scoffed and ran to the thresher, with Flora literally dragging behind him. She lay exhausted in the dirt, and Elvis climbed the machine to embrace his old friend. The two men hugged and caught up on recent events. Eli had spent the last few months at the logging site, meaning he had not seen Elvis in quite some time. As this reunion was taking place, a short, middle-aged, balding, but suspiciously flexible man minced his way towards the party. Gramslinger was intrigued, though Craig and Steve were simply bemused. The man stood in front of the party, then immediately did the splits. "Hello, darlings," he greeted them. "Simply wondrous to see you, isn't it?" They stood in silence, though Steve eventually muttered, "What is this for—" Her words were cut off as the man interrupted her to say, "The name is Albert Cheeseborough." Albert again did the splits. It was going to be a long day. Flora got to her feet and shouted at Eli, "Get down from there, or else!" Eli, annoyed at being interrupted by a little twerp, shouted down at Flora, "Oh, hi, aren't you a little lady? Are you here to fight me?" He burst into laughter. Dismissing the idea of being physically bested by a girl, he boasted down to her, "Tell you what, I bet you can't push me into this threshing machine." He stood atop the machine, flexing his muscles, showing off his large frame, which wasn't quite as muscular and impressive as he imagined himself to be in his head. Elvis stood next to him and erupted into a fit of laughter at his friend's outrageous behaviour. Flora did not feel beaten and deflated, as one might expect. Instead, she merely sat herself down and vowed to bide her time until the moment was right. Craig listened to Albert as he laid out the demands of the loggers. They seemed reasonable enough demands. They wanted slaves to be sent to work under them to do the more dangerous and backbreaking of tasks, and they wanted an increase of rations. Craig decided to accept the terms and informed Albert that the slaves and supplies would be sent on as soon as the men went back to work. Albert seemed a reasonable, if rather peculiar man. His assless chaps certainly were rather queer-looking. The other men waited patiently to hear what Albert would say, though they looked hopeful of a peaceful resolution to the standoff. Albert danced and twirled his way towards the threshing machine. He started to gush as he told Eli, "I've just been speaking to that man over there. That one there you see with the cat ears. Oh, isn't he gorgeous? Yes, he's just gorgeous. Anyway, he said to me that the elder accepts our demands and that we can go back to work." Eli seemed shocked. He hadn't planned for the elder to accept his terms. He could only stroke his chin and manage to say, "I see," before he was sent flying in the air towards the deadly blades of the threshing machine, which were just starting to spin into action. In all the commotion, no one had noticed that the threshing machine had fired into action. As Eli went flying to his doom, he spun round to see the force that had propelled him to his death. It was Flora. She had been able to push him into the threshing machine after all. Eli, unwilling to meet his death without first avenging it, threw the vial of tree poison into Flora's direction. The vial smashed in her face, splashing her shapely mouth, button nose, and baby blue eyes with corrosive acid. Flora screamed in agony, though her pain was somewhat less than Eli's, as he was chopped into tiny pieces by the spinning blades of the threshing machine. Elvis roared in anger after witnessing his friend's demise. Flora had proved that she could push Eli into the threshing machine, but at what cost? Chaos ensued, though Flora was to witness none of it as she passed out due to the pain of her burning facial tissue. When Flora awoke, gently roused to consciousness by her husband's frantic shaking of her shoulders, she found everyone had gathered around her. Elvis looked furious, Craig looked terribly concerned, whilst everyone else seemed shocked. Gramslinger cried out, "Her face! It's even uglier than before!" Craig dismissed the statement, insisting that her face looked beautiful, though Flora noted that he used the past tense. Flora was less concerned about her appearance than of the mission, and asked the men when they would be returning to work. Albert reassured her. "Don't worry, darling. I'm in charge of all these scrappy young men here now, and I insist they go straight back to work, immediately." The loggers grumbled as they returned to their work duties. The little rebellion was over. Elvis snapped at Flora. "Well, you've killed a great man. Now every time you look in a mirror, you can be reminded of what an ugly murderer you are." Elvis then stormed off. Craig reassured his wife that she would remain beautiful in his eyes no matter what acid melted her face. He told her, "Every part of you is beautiful, from your dainty little feet up to your, lovely neck, yeah." Flora groaned. Her face must really be ruined. It certainly felt extremely painful. It had been a tough learning experience for her. She shouted towards Elvis, "But he said I couldn't push him into the threshing machine, and I was just showing him that I could." Perhaps she hadn't learned any lessons after all. It was a quiet journey back to the Ark as the members of the party reflected on their thoughts. Steve pondered how he could improve the efficiency of the underwear masks. Elvis angrily thought of how stupid and senseless Eli's death had been. Flora thought that surely her handsome husband would leave her now rather than stay loyal to a woman with half a face. Gramslinger thought that he hadn't had much to do this episode. Craig thought back to the beautiful rose of the other Ark and said to himself that if given the chance he'd taken Flora with her acid-scarred face over Rose's breathtaking beauty every day of the week, and twice on Sundays.
Chapter 7. Man on Fire. Gramslinger yawned as he turned his pillow over, hoping to find a relaxing cool warmth on the other side. Instead, he found some partially dried drool. He remembered how he had performed the same procedure earlier on, though time seemed hazy and confusing to him. He felt his toes being licked. This was not right, Gramslinger felt as he looked down to the bed to see what could be doing such a licking. Ah, yes, it was his new dog. What a silly girl she is. Time to get up, he thought to himself. The dog rushed to his lap as Gramslinger sat up in bed. As he petted and stroked the creature, the morning fogginess melted away. Looking deeply into his faithful mutt's eyes, he knew that today would be a good day. It was a rather less pleasant morning for Craig. He had been aroused from his slumber by the sound of weeping. Flora was at the end of the bed, looking away from him. She seemed to have been crying for quite some time. "Are you crying, sweetness?" he asked. Flora sniffled, paused for a second, and said, "No, I'm fine." Craig knew that she was hiding her feelings again, so began to probe further. "Is it about your feet again? I've told you 1,000 times that it doesn't matter if every toe is perfectly straight. Your feet are very cute and sexy. Why, Flora, now flashing with rage at the topic of her feet being discussed, swiveled round and screamed at him. "It's not my fucking feet! It's this!" Flora pointed at her acid-burned face. Her melted cheeks were covered with oozing pus-filled sores. Her lips were black and torn. Her little nose had almost entirely disappeared, replaced only by hideous scarring and a vaguely flesh-coloured lump. She also had no eyebrow hairs whatsoever, though she hadn't really had any to speak of before the acid attack. "Oh yeah," Craig mumbled. "I forgot about the acid in the face thing."
He tried to find words of comfort, but his brain was unable to provide him with any, so he just quietly rose to his feet and told Flora he would be back with some breakfast. Craig met Gramslinger in the kitchen area. The two men nodded as they stood in line for breakfast. The residents of the Ark were slightly bemused to see Craig and Gramslinger just repeatedly nodding their heads in the queue. No one questioned them, however. Steve quietly whispered to Elvis, "A little post-traumatic stress, I think." Elvis simply said, "Ah. Probably difficult for him having to live with that moody bitch all day." Steve continued. Elvis replied, "Fair. I agree that must be difficult for poor Craig." Steve furrowed his brow. "I meant Gramslinger," he clarified. Elvis smirked as he wandered off to join the breakfast queue. Gramslinger finally reached the front of the queue and was handed a small, half-rotten apple. "Is this all?" he asked the chef, his voice betraying his sense of dismay. The chef looked up, wiped his nose with his sleeve, and said, "Oh, sorry, didn't realize you were a hero," and handed over another small, half-rotten apple. It was at this moment that the elder spotted our heroes and asked them to join them in his room. Having been reassured that breakfast would be provided by the elder, Craig joined Gramslinger and Steve in following their leader into his private quarters. "There you go," said the elder as he handed Craig 4 medium-sized, extremely rotten apples. "My beloved can't eat this crap," Craig exclaimed. "She's used to the best." The elder raised an eyebrow and remarked, "Well, yes, I mean she married you, didn't she?" Craig, Gramslinger and Steve nodded in agreement, though Steve was distracted as he was eyeing up the delicious rotting apples on display. The elder stepped back and turned around, before swiveling to face him in rather dramatic fashion. "It's actually about the food situation that I've brought you all in here," he started. "To put not too fine a point on it, we're running out of grub." Gramslinger cried out, "But we don't eat grubs!" Steve looked away to his guilt. He then thought about the delicious apple and grub sandwich he ate last night. The elder spoke frankly. "Well, listen, if you guys don't go out into those wastes and secure some supplies for us, then we'll have to start eating slaves. And then who will build our water wheels and mills?" Before either Steve or Gramslinger could reply, he hissed, "That question was rhetorical." The men left the elder's room to return to their private quarters. Steve was still scratching his head as he wondered what the word rhetorical could mean. Gramslinger was greeted at his quarters by his dog, and immediately returned to the optimistic mood he had before breakfast. "Today is going to be a good day," he told himself. Craig opened the door to his quarters. They were still his quarters, he would tell people. His quarters just subsumed Flora's. Flora had fashioned a long black veil to cover her face and body, which now covered her from head to toe. It was a contrast to the revealing and sensual rags that she usually wore, though was an understandable choice of clothing considering the hideousness of her face. Craig handed Flora her breakfast, saying that "This breakfast is as sweet as you are." However, that seemed to be a sarcastic remark considering how rotten the apples were. Flora gave Craig a disgusted look, though he couldn't tell as she was wearing the veil. He continued to talk, rather unwisely, stating that "Those clothes aren't like your usual unique and sexy style. Not that you don't look unique and sexy now. I mean, your face is unique." He trailed off into silence. He took solace by biting into his apple, though soon regretted that decision. The taste of the sour apple turned his face into a look of revulsion as he spoke again. "I mean, what will we tell people about your new style? It looks like you've joined a cult." Flora, feeling lower on self-confidence than ever, shot back at him. "I don't care what people think about me. Tell them I've joined a cult. That's fine." It was an awkward morning, though Flora agreed to join the party on their mission into the wastes. Gary, the mystic seer, was assigned to the party. He had seen visions of a warehouse full of food and the entrails of a slave that had been dissected. Gary had unusual talents. He was also permanently on fire. His pyrokinetic and plant mutations were strong, though his mind was weak from the cannabis smoking habit he had. Some speculated that the visions were psychotic episodes caused from the drug abuse, though even ardent skeptics were forced to admit that Gary's prophecies usually ended up coming true. As the party walked away from the Ark, the flames emanating from Gary's skin keeping them warm in the cold night air, Flora explained why she believed in the supernatural. She reminded them of the oracle who had foretold that she would have a difficult marriage. The party walked on, feeling rather awkward, though they soon felt rather elated as the cannabis fumes emitted from Gary began to quell the tension in the group. Steve asked why they didn't get Gary to grow nutritious plants and use them to feed the Ark, but everyone was too stoned to pay attention to the idea. The party wandered through the wastes all day and all night, passing through miles of crumbling ruins. Time seemed to pass quickly and yet slowly at the same time.
The monsters and cretins that lived in Deadwood and marshlands between Long Tongue and the southern borders of Stoke seemed to pay little attention to the party. Perhaps it was the toxic fumes and unnatural flames coming from Gary's body that scared them off. Whatever the explanation, it was quite fortunate, as nobody in the party was sober enough to fight. However, eventually they began to build up a tolerance for the passive smoke they were inhaling. "Congratulations, you have entered a minefield," said the mechanical voice. That really sobered the party up. "Who said that?" Craig asked of the darkness. "It was I," said the voice. Craig responded. "I?" The voice replied. "Aye, it was I." Steve spoke out. "Who am I?" The voice spoke back. "I do not know." Steve was confused. Flora was annoyed. She demanded to know the name of the person speaking to them. A small robot zipped into view in front of them. "It is I, Minesweeper Bob. Welcome to my minefield." Bob then dug his tiny arms into the dirt in front of them and picked up a mine, then proceeded to sweep the mine with a brush that appeared from Bob's rear end. Sensing the danger that the party were in, Gramslinger activated his mind powers and forced Bob to lead the party on a safe path through the minefield. Craig, though grateful, was confused. "I didn't think your mind powers would work on a robot," he said to Gramslinger. "Neither did I," he responded. As the party exited the minefield, Gary spoke up to say that his visions were guiding him towards a large warehouse that dominated the overgrown ruins of the borderlands. Flora stormed off towards the front entrance, though the others remained unconvinced by Gary, who, as far as they could tell, seemed to be making it all up as he went along. Flora stood agape at the front of the giant warehouse, though nobody could see her open-mouthed due to the veil. The rest of the party gathered around her and were equally amazed by the sight inside. The warehouse was a thriving, bustling, fully functioning food warehouse. It was staffed by robots. These automatons were busily packing parcels of food onto trucks, to what end none of them could fathom. What was apparent was that Gary had been right all along. He was the answer to the Ark's food crisis. Craig led the party inside. He investigated a large truck that was parked close to the entrance. It was full of all varieties of food, enough to keep the Ark fed for a month. Suddenly, a booming voice echoed around them. "State your purpose." Craig looked up to see a giant robotic figure lurching over the truck. How it had crept up on them, he had no idea. They all looked at one another, fumbling for words to say. Gramslinger then pointed his fingers to his temples and began to make a straining noise as he scrunched up his face. He vocalized. He had seemed to have gone mad, but instead the giant robot belted out. "Understood. You will take this vehicle to the Long Tongue." The robot then turned on its heels and stomped off. Gramslinger had done it. The truck full of food was theirs. The mission was a success. They had secured supplies of food. The only question was how they would get it back to the Ark. Gary was the only one among them who knew how to drive, but he did not have a driver's license, and so was therefore unable to drive. "We'll give it a try anyway," Craig insisted. Gary had smoked a particularly large blunt to celebrate their success, and was feeling unusually confident. He stepped into the cab of the truck, which immediately caught fire. Not one to be defeated, the party collected water from a nearby cabinet and extinguished the fire. Gary was safe. Most of the flammable contents of the cab were burnt and wet now. However, he was still yet to attempt driving the vehicle. "Here goes nothing," he said as he turned the ignition key, which had been untouched by the flames. The engine started. It was a miracle. Gary hit the accelerator, and the truck jerked into life and began to head off in the direction of the Ark. The rest of the party stayed behind as the truck was filled with supplies. They would have to find their own way back, without Gary. As the truck rolled onto the open road, Gary turned and shouted back at them through the open window. "I've just had another vision. Head north to the hospital. You'll find a cure for Flora's face there." Chapter 8. The operation is a complete success. Sort of. Loud whirring noises and clanging sounds filled the air. The robots behind them in the warehouse were not happy. Perhaps the giant's automaton had realized the trick Gramslinger had played on its mind. Not wishing to overstay their welcome, the party bolted out of the warehouse and ran as fast as they could out of the open door and up the road that led to the north. Craig's agile cat legs carried him far, whilst Gramslinger's dog legs also gave him a quick head start on the others. Flora and Steve were not impressed. They eventually saw the funny side of it as they settled into a more relaxed pace on the road northwards. The robots had not left the warehouse to pursue them. Night was quickly turning into daylight, which was fortunate as Gary was no longer around to repel the creatures of the wastes. Having found the relative safety of an old ruined house atop a steep hill, with no danger in sight for miles around, the party decided to rest for a short time. As Flora shut the door to the house behind her,
She thought she saw a flaming comet in the distance, leaving behind a trail of fire in its wake. She shook her head and told herself she was imagining things. The building was dark and would remain so well into the morning, until that time when the sun's lights would penetrate through the thick dust that covered the windows around them. She would be able to sleep peacefully in her husband's arms. Flora awoke alone, but having risen to her feet she soon found the rest of the party. They were standing at the front door, staring out into the distance. "What's going on?" she asked of them. "Fire," came the reply. She pushed past them to take a look. Indeed, the whole forests of the southern lands were ablaze. It was fortunate that they were heading north. Suddenly a sense of realization dawned on her. That was no comet she had seen last night. What she had seen was Gary in the truck, setting ablaze to the trees around him as he drove past. She told the others. It was agreed that Gary might be a chill guy and useful party member, but he was one dumbass stoner. With smoke blowing its way towards them, it was important that the party continued on to the hospital in the north. They had little recourse with the fire slowly gaining on them. Clouds gathered overhead. It was hoped that rain would quell the fires before any more precious natural resources were lost. The southern forests made a pleasant change from the usual collapsed ruins of the rest of the city, so the party hurried onward up the winding northern road. They eventually saw a large series of buildings, and Craig noticed signs that read hospital. They had found their destination, but what they were to look for inside remained a mystery. A series of burnt-out vehicles lay outside what appeared to be the main entrance of the largest of the buildings. Craig led his team towards it, though once they advanced closer they noticed a figure standing at the door. The figure looked at them, but did not move. Craig continued towards them, slowly but confidently walking straight at them. The figure remained stationary, and Craig wondered if they were still alive. As Craig reached within 10 yards of the building, the figure called out, "Halt!" It was another automaton. The others joined Craig. They were nervous at the possibility of confrontation. "State your business at this facility," said the machine. Craig replied that he was looking for a way to cure his wife's face. The robot moved its head to look Gramslinger up and down. "Yes, it is clear that this unit's face is severely malfunctioning." "That's not my wife," Craig said. "She's the one in the long black veil." Gramslinger caught a reflection of himself in the wing mirror of one of the abandoned vehicles. "Severely malfunctioned?" he whispered, as a single tear rolled down his face. "State your business at this facility," repeated the machine. Craig again explained the situation, but the automaton refused them entry. "Valid ID required. Request denied." The party gathered into a huddle to discuss their next move. Steve spoke up. "Why don't we just go past the machine? It can't physically stop us from going inside. It's bolted to the floor." Flora snapped. "Shut up, Steve. That's a stupid idea." She continued to speak. "Why don't we just walk past the robot? It hasn't got legs, so it can't stop us." Steve was sure that he had heard something very similar to that only seconds before, but the party had already agreed with Flora's brilliant suggestion. "State your business at this facility," the machine barked as they edged past it. It was indeed powerless to stop them, and swiveled its head back to face away from the front entrance once they had sneaked down the corridor and out of sight. With that obstacle avoided, the next problem was to work out where they would find a cure for the broken face. Craig read every sign they came across, though none seemed to fit their situation. Eventually, though, a sign was found that read, "Experimental Face Surgery Department. Follow this arrow." That seemed a promising sign. The party walked deeper into the facility, making sure to not wander away from the red-arrowed line that led them down corridor after corridor. As they progressed further into the hospital, Gramslinger's super-sensitive dog ears pricked up. Craig also sensed a noise and motioned for the others to brace for combat. They hid in a nearby room, leaving the door ajar to spy on their pursuer. Unaware that he had been rumbled, a small wiry man carried on past the door, with two larger and deadlier-looking men following behind him. Steve recognized them as zone ghouls, predatory individuals who killed on sight and salvaged what they could from their victims before moving on to the next target. There was no reasoning with these men. They would have to kill or be killed. The party searched the room around them, but found nothing that they could use. Suddenly, Flora remembered that she had something for such a situation. She rummaged through her rucksack and found a grenade. Flora scurried after the men, and once she was in range she pulled the pin on the grenade and threw it at them. The explosion was deafening, even to Gramslinger and Craig as they covered their sensitive ears. The ghouls had been obliterated. Flora smiled, though nobody could see her lips, and said, "All clear." As they neared the end of the red line, Flora began to wonder what experimental face surgery could entail. It sounded painful. They eventually reached a white door, which they pushed open to find a small room with a large machine. The room still had power, as the solar-powered generators on the roof still functioned. The machine had a sign that said on it, "Insert face here." Craig informed Flora, and she placed her face in the hole, as instructed. Steve noticed a large red button and proceeded to press it. The machine whirled into action, first clamping poor Flora's head down. Flora screamed until her voice was hoarse, and Craig could only look on in horror as the machine completed its procedure. After some minutes of frantic inaction by the men, with Flora clamped in place amid whirring and buzzing from the machine, her screams were agonized as she described horrific pain, even worse than she had endured in suffering the injury. A ding signalled that the procedure was over. The clamps released, and Flora removed her head from the hole. She turned to face the others as they looked on at her open-mouthed. Her face was extremely swollen and lumpy, but the sores and burns were gone. She looked vaguely human again. The pain had also stopped, though this may have been due to the drugs that the machine had pumped into her. Craig told himself that the swelling would go down. Steve told Flora that she had always looked ugly anyway. Flora told him to piss off. With Flora now sort of fixed, she and Craig walked back to the Ark, hand in hand. Gramslinger and Steve were not holding hands, but they were pleased to have successfully completed another mission. They pushed past the robot at the front entrance. "State your business at this facility," it said, as they tried to ignore it. It continued to repeat its catchphrase as the party walked off into the distance, searching for the D-road that would lead them back to the Ark. As had been predicted earlier, the clouds rained down upon the land, extinguishing the raging fires in the forest below. The journey back to the Ark was long and wet, though largely uneventful. As they approached the Ark several hours later, they noticed the food truck not sat empty outside the Ark. Gary must have returned home safely. They also observed that a large water wheel was working away. The slaves must have been busy constructing it during their absence. It was a fine-looking structure, one that would provide a small amount of electricity for the Ark to use for whatever purpose they found useful. Flora stepped into the Ark first and was greeted with cheers and applause. "All hail the beautiful and smart Flora, saviour of the Ark!" the people cried out. "Our Queen!" Craig was next to enter, as equally loud cheers rang out to celebrate his safe return. "Three cheers for the King!" someone shouted, though the elders shot them a disapproving look. Steve and Gramslinger then walked in and were politely applauded. The residents of the Ark were delighted to see their hero's safe return. Food from the truck was quickly handed out to the party, who were famished after their arduous trek across the wastes. A face that Craig didn't recognise was present in the crowd. He motioned towards them and inquired their name. The person stepped forward to introduce themselves. They were wearing a black hood and bandages that covered the upper part of their face, though snake-bite lip rings were still visible, as was a nose ring. Their skin was tanned, and black markings traversed their arms, neck, and legs. They had black trousers and wore a black flared shirt with frilled purple lace, and beads covered their upper body. It was correct to say that this was the cringiest-looking dumbass to ever step foot inside the Ark. The person spoke out in a deep, raspy voice that was obviously completely fake, seemingly in a failed attempt to sound cool or interesting. "The name is Apollo, with 2 L's, said Apollo. Silence filled the room. Everyone looked awkwardly at each other. Steve was the first to speak. "She seems weird." Apollo's face turned red. "Hey, I'm not a she, moron," they replied indignantly. "Cool your tits," said Gramslinger. Apollo spoke back to say they didn't have tits. Flora said, "Oh yeah? Well, neither do I, but that's no reason to be a jerk." The residents of the Ark began to talk among themselves. Tom Holland, Adam Driver, RuPaul, and Draco Malfoy all agreed that Apollo was some kind of weird loser character that no one liked. The elder emerged from the crowd and began to speak. "Hey, it may be true that Apollo is a greasy-haired creep, but they have a powerful ability to see into the future just by touching an object, so you all better get used to them being around." More murmurings of discontent echoed around the room. "But he's so lame," someone screamed. Apollo spoke out again. "Actually, I'm gender fluid, I have no genitalia, and I'm LGBTQ+, also I'm in a polyamorous relationship with these 2 fine gilfs right here." They pointed towards 2 elderly women who slowly edged their way towards Apollo and pressed their wrinkled faces together as the threesome exchanged bodily fluids with an extremely sloppy and disturbing French kiss. Everybody threw up a little in their mouths. Chapter 9. Murder at the Tesco Express. A blood-curdling scream rang out across the whole of the Ark, chilling each and every resident of the Ark to the very core. It had come from the generator room, which was half completed and had been left unoccupied so that the slaves could rest after many days of hard work. Craig and Gramslinger had been walking nearby the generator, and so were the first on the scene. The room was untouched, though there was a body lying dead on the floor. Unfortunately, it was not Apollo. Instead, it was a security guard named Tom who had perished. There was a look of terror on Tom's face. His eyes were bulging out of his skull, and there was blood running from his nose into his goatee beard. However, there was no sign of an attacker or a struggle. Gramslinger began to hear voices in his head, voices that were not his own. The voices said things like, "Kill them all, the intruders are near," and "You're gay." Craig did not seem to hear them, which led Gramslinger to the conclusion that either he was losing his mind, or that a powerful psychic power was lingering in the area. His suspicions immediately turned to Apollo, the powerful, future-predicting weirdo who had recently joined the Ark. As other residents burst into the room to see the ghastly scene, he asked them, where was Apollo? Apollo eventually made their way to the generator room to see what the commotion was. Apollo had just returned from a brief trip into the wastes to help evaluate the water supply situation. It was a serious situation, life and death in fact, which had required the Elder's presence. Apollo was therefore indignant upon being questioned by Gramslinger about their whereabouts. The Elder was not impressed by Gramslinger's wild accusations and paranoid theories. Apollo had a rock-solid alibi. It had not even been established that Tom had been murdered by someone with psychic powers, though a later post-mortem would confirm the cause of death. Murder by psychic means. A murderer loose in the Ark was the last thing that the Elder needed. People were falling ill, the water supply was compromised, slaves were becoming unruly. These were difficult problems, and quick solutions were needed for them all. The Elder set the party with the task of bringing the murderer to justice. Once they had been dealt with, then work could begin on finding a new water source. The disease situation would have to be monitored. Initially, only a small number of residents had taken ill with the new disease. Their faces became blotchy, and they found themselves sweating profusely and unable to get out of bed as they were stricken with fever. None had yet perished, which was a relief. Perhaps the disease would pass without taking any lives, but the murderer would likely strike again. Craig put on a rather fetching hat and stroked his chin. He needed clues if he was to solve this crime. He ordered the party to split up and look for clues. This was not something that he would normally suggest, but as the Elder had assigned Apollo to accompany them in the investigation, it gave Craig a good excuse to keep them on the other side of the Ark, where they didn't have to see their stupid face. Craig went to the main hall to question residents as to who would want to kill Tom. It quickly became apparent that nobody had a genuine motive for murder, despite minor quarrels and disputes. What's more, nobody seemed to have the means to be able to do the deed. Steve was assigned with dissecting Tom's body to find any clues could be discovered that way. He found that Tom was filled with blood, organs, and bones. Steve wasn't sure if this was usual, but he had a lot of fun in taking the body apart. His experiments, though enjoyable, were a complete waste of time. Flora was tasked with exploring Tom's quarters to see if any information could be gleaned from there. She found a small collection of runes which Tom apparently spent a lot of time playing with. There were supplies of food and water, as well as reading materials. It seemed that Tom had been trying to teach himself to read. Nothing seemed particularly relevant to the investigation, though Flora gathered all Tom's possessions and put them in her giant rucksack. After all, she never did know when some of it might prove useful later. Apollo was poking around the generator room, seeing if any clues had been missed there. Gramslinger was supposed to be searching the nearby area with his dog, sniffing out any scent or signs of suspicious activity. Yet Gramslinger was not looking for clues. He was spying on Apollo in the generator room. Gramslinger was peeping through the keyhole of the generator room door, and he observed Apollo creeping around the room when suddenly they picked up a piece of card. Gramslinger tensed as he witnessed Apollo begin to chant, "Achilles, Achilles, Achilles, come down. Won't you get up off the roof? Get up off the roof. You're scaring us and all of us." He could not take it any longer. Gramslinger used his psychic powers to send everyone a message in the Ark, ordering them to come to the generator room. Most of the residents rushed to the generator room, though many stayed away out of fear. They had never heard a voice inside their head, apart from their own internal dialogue. Some feared it was a trap. The crowd that quickly gathered outside the room were greeted by Gramslinger, who told them to prepare to see the murderer. He then stood still for a few minutes, as more people gathered. The Elder Flora, Steve and Craig all pushed through the crowd to the front. Gramslinger refused to elaborate before he finally flung open the door. Inside was Apollo, sitting on a chair and looking rather nonplussed by the intrusion. Gramslinger was triumphant and began shouting, "I've caught you! I've caught you! We can see what you're up to, murderer!" Apollo stood up and looked around them. The crowd looked at them. "Caught them doing what?" Flora asked. Apollo raised an eyebrow as everyone looked towards Gramslinger. The part dog, part human mutant began to rumble. "I saw them chanting some weird tune, and they were saying things. I'm sure of it." Craig wondered aloud who or what had gathered them to the room. Gramslinger answered him, saying, "It was me. I am a powerful psychic, and I sent a message to everyone to order them here to see Apollo commit their crime." The crowd gasped. Gramslinger had just admitted to possessing psychic powers. They were very clearly acting very strangely, and seemed quite deranged, blaming poor Apollo for a crime that they had a solid alibi for and no motive to commit. The elder boomed out, "So you have found the murderer! It's you, Gramslinger!" The accused man began to panic. "No, it's definitely Apollo. Let's go to their quarter and I'm sure we'll find evidence there." The elder was not convinced, but Apollo began to act defensive, seeing that nobody was allowed in their room. The elder asked Apollo if they had permission to take a quick look at their quarters. Apollo blurted out, "No thanks," but soon relented as they realised that suspicions were now turning against them. Apollo led the elder, Craig, Flora, Steve and Gramslinger to their small quarters. As a newcomer to the Ark, they had only a small space, and it proved to be rather untidy, with possessions scattered all over the place. Gramslinger frantically searched for evidence of criminality, but found none. All that was found was a rather large collection of books. Craig was impressed. "Ah, so you can read, then. Maybe I've misjudged you somewhat, Apollo. These texts are quite impressive." Though he regretted those words after Apollo began to speak. "Oh, no, actually, I've not actually read any of them. I just think they look really cool. Check out the cover of this copy of Dante's Inferno. Isn't it pretty?" Everyone stood and looked at Apollo in disbelief. "What a sad poser," Steve commented. Flora wanted to agree, but instead asked Apollo if she could lend the book, as she would like to actually read it. Despite being embarrassed by the raid, Apollo had been proven innocent, or at least that there was not a shred of evidence to suggest that they had killed Tom. Gramslinger, therefore, looked as guilty as ever. With no other suspects to speak of, the elder came to the bold conclusion that Gramslinger was the murderer. There was much debate and shouting, with Craig pleading Gramslinger's case. Eventually the elder relented and agreed that the usual penalty for murder, death, would not be appropriate in light of Gramslinger's years of service to the Ark. It was agreed that instead Gramslinger would be sold into sexual slavery to the colony of butt pirates in the eastern lands. Gramslinger sobbed, though was secretly excited to meet his new masters. As Gramslinger was led away out of the Ark, the residents let out a cheer. The hated murderer was gone forever, though Gramslinger would be greatly missed by Flora, Steve and Craig. Craig immediately stormed off to the elder's room, demanding to be given a new party member to support his crew on future journeys. The elder considered assigning Apollo, though felt that would be an unfair punishment for the team that had just solved the murder of the Ark, even if it was one of the team that had actually done the crime. Instead, he led Craig down a rarely used passage to reach the Dawn Vault. Craig wondered what he was being led to see. Artefacts from the Dawn Vault were extremely rare, forgotten relics of the time before the apocalypse. How could a party member come from an artefact, he wondered. The elder looked around to ensure that nobody had followed them, and then reached into his pocket to retrieve a key. He pushed aside some old boxes and revealed a hidden door. The elder inserted the key and unlocked the door. It seemed as though the door had not been opened in many years. What Craig saw when the door opened amazed him. As the door opened, it revealed a large automaton. The robot was 7 feet tall and looked extremely powerful. Craig could not guess at what the robot's purpose could have been. It was bright purple and had many holes and seemed like it had seen enough battles to last a millennia. Cradled in its arms was a large rifle. This machine was built for war. The elder saw the apprehension in Craig's eyes and said simply, "Desperate times call for desperate measures. What alternative do we have?" It was at this moment that Apollo came round the corner. Craig went to shut the door, but the elder prevented him, saying, "It's time for everyone to meet our new scavenger." The elder pressed a button on the control panel next to the robot. The machine whirred into life, making a terrific noise as the cogs and gears inside stirred into life. The machine's eyes began to glow, and Apollo clung to the elder in fear as the machine began to speak. "I am Rubo. Who is my master?" asked the robot. The two men and one non-gendered person stood and looked at each other. The elder spoke out. "I am the elder. I am your master, and I bid you to follow the commands of this man here, Craig." Rubo looked down at the humans before him and spoke. "It is pleasant to meet you, sirs." Apollo cleared their throat and said, "Actually, I'm not a sir. I use neo-pronouns. You can refer to me as a she, they, them ghost pirate." Rubo raised a hand to Apollo's weak face and bellowed out, "Whatever." Craig smiled. He thought he was going to like this new robot person. As the residents of the Ark settled to sleep that night, a lone zone ghoul wandered out from their hiding place behind the Ark. They were mumbling nonsense to themselves as a rat king scurried towards them. The ghoul pointed their fingers to their temples and started chanting. The rats immediately stopped dead, with blood pouring from their ears. The ghoul wandered off into the night. No one had known they had ever been near the Ark. Chapter 10. That's one backwards-ass statue. With the growing rates of infection, soon the number of diseased residents would outnumber the healthy. The quarantine ward was well full beyond capacity. The Ark had its priorities in order, though. The remaining healthy slaves were hard at work erecting a statue of the beloved Flora. If every one of them were to be wiped out, then they needed to leave a lasting monument to her beauty and wisdom. In truth, her days of beauty were behind her, as her face was no longer swollen from the transplant, but remained a mere shadow of its former self. A fat, lumpy shadow. She was also one of the infected in the quarantine area, leaving red blotches all over her bedridden body. Craig hoped that she would make a full recovery, though he was fully aware that she would never be back to her former state before the acid attack. Craig was very determined that the stonemason they had captured from the wastes understood the importance of his task. Craig instructed the man to capture the true essence of Flora. He insisted that it should be a flawless statue. Sure, she could make an arse of herself sometimes, but this statue was to be a permanent legacy to her best features. Anything less than perfection from the stonemason would be bare-faced cheek. A bum result would mean his execution. The stonemason seemed to understand his task, and insisted that he did not need any assistance. Craig had wondered why the stonemason had winked when he said that, but was hopeful that the statue would prove pleasing on the eye. It was early morning when the stonemason announced that he was ready to reveal his work. The healthy residents followed him outside and eagerly awaited the unveiling. The elder gave a speech, saying that he was saddened that Flora was not well enough to witness the great occasion, but reiterated his belief that she would soon make a full recovery, as would the rest of the infected residents. He then pulled back the veil to reveal the statue in all its glory. The crowd gasped. The stonemason beamed with pride. Craig was shocked. The statue was a perfect replica of Flora in all her former beauty. One key detail was wrong, however. The buttocks of the statue were facing the front. Shocked murmurs and whispers filled the air, while the stonemason began to speak. Normally slaves would not be permitted to speak, but artists were permitted this indulgence. He explained what Craig had said to him, pointing out that if all of Flora's best features were placed at the front, then it would save people time from going around the rear to take a look. He further explained that all the available stone had been used up in creating the statue, and that it was impossible for any alterations to be made at this time. Craig stood up and raised his arms, bidding the crowd to silence. He gave a short but powerful speech. "My friends, this is a perfect statue, because it represents my beautifully imperfect Flora in all her contradictions. It shows her best assets all at once, saving people the bother of going round to look at the rear end, because the rear end is at the front. It is the best statue of Flora I have ever seen. I love Flora, and I love this. Well, I will grow to, in time, love this statue." The crowd applauded. Craig strangled the stonemason to death later that night. Apollo rolled their eyes after seeing the statue. They felt the statue was gross, that Flora was gross, and indeed that everyone in the Ark was gross. They might have had a point about the statue. Apollo styled back their greasy, unwashed hair and headed off to see the elder for a private word. The elder welcomed Apollo inside his office and asked them to speak their mind quickly, as he was short of time and manpower with all the disease that was spreading throughout the Ark. The disease now had a name. The residents called it redpox, due mainly to the fact that its distinguishing feature was that it caused red pox to appear all over the patient's body. Apollo began to speak. "From my scientific experiments and observational testimonials, I have concluded the following informationoids." The elder interrupted them. "Hey, speak English, man." Apollo turned a bright shade of red, and then continued. Well, I think that the disease spreads through water. I think the water is contaminated, and that we must look for a new water source. I believe if we find a new water source, we can save the Ark. The elder stroked his chin, then stood up from his chair and went to the door. He called Craig, Steve, and Rubo to join him with Apollo to discuss their next mission. The two men and one genderless robot entered the elder's quarters. Steve and Craig nodded in acknowledgement of Apollo's presence, whilst Rubo said, "Greetings, Apollo." Apollo responded by saying, "Actually, it's Apollo with two L's, thank you." The elder relayed what Apollo had told them, and went on to say that Elvis would be accompanying the four of them in leading the expedition of the remaining fit slaves to the southern ruins, where they were to reroute the Trent River towards the Ark. Steve and Craig grumbled at the prospect of Apollo joining the party, but all accepted that the mission was vitally important, and they must each put aside their differences and work together for the greater good. Elvis rounded up the remaining slaves and snapped a warning at them that any funny business would result in him snapping their hands off with his massive crocodile jaws. None were foolish enough to test Elvis's patience. Besides which, the large and imposing Rubo also made them anxious not to upset their masters in any way. Craig hugged back at the Ark for some private time alone with Flora, insisting that he would catch up with the rest of the party later. No healthy person was permitted any contact with any infected person, but quarantine rules did not apply to two heroes of the Ark. Craig told her all about the statue, missing out the part as to where her crotch should be. The news could wait until she was feeling better. Craig indeed soon caught up with the rest of the party, who were moving slowly so as to not tire out the slaves before the real work began. As they walked on in silence, Craig attempted to break the ice by asking Apollo about themselves. Apollo explained their backstory, their motivations, and indeed their entire life story. But nobody was listening, as Apollo was extremely boring and uninteresting. Craig eventually whispered to Steve, asking, "What did Apollo say?" "I wasn't listening." Steve replied, "I don't know. I wasn't listening either. I think it was something about being gay." Apollo continued to drone on. "And then I worked in a shop for a while. I had the chance to do lots of interesting and cool things, but I didn't bother because it was easier to just stay in on my own. I don't like new things. I like hiding away and doing the same old safe and boring routine." Rubo began to yawn, which was extremely unusual, as robots weren't programmed to feel boredom or need sleep. The journey south to the river was very short, though it seemed to take an eternity to the party as they politely pretended to listen to Apollo's endless speech. The slaves were fearful. They hoped that they wouldn't be forced to listen to Apollo on the way back. Once the party reached their destination, they quickly found out that they had encountered a problem. The riverbanks were full of hard clay, which would make digging out a diversion in the river very difficult. Craig wailed, "Oh, if only Flora was here, she would have something brilliantly useful in her bag that she could find, and would save the day." Sadly, though, Flora was ill in quarantine, and no timescale could be placed on her recovery. Elvis said that he would help the slaves to dig through the hard clay soil, but even with all of them working together, the slaves and the slave driver, it was still taking far too long to divert the river. Apollo touched the hard clay and sensed a brief glimpse of a future in which the party spent a week digging out the trenches needed to divert the river. Though the vision had not foretold the fate of the Ark, they now knew that a week was too long for their mission, as that would likely mean the disease had spread to infect everyone in the Ark. Apollo fiddled with their snakebite piercings as they developed a plan. With the slaves now pummeling the clay with their shovels, Apollo spoke up to propose that the party instead journey north to the Ark's original water source and somehow cleanse the water there. Apollo added that it's probably just a dead body inside. If we shift it, then it should be drinkable again. Elvis lost his temper and snapped at Apollo. "And what if we discover that we can't purify that water? Then we'd have lost a day's worth of digging here." It was a gamble, but as Craig looked on at the hard-working slaves breaking their tools on the hard clay, he realized that they had no option but to take that gamble. "Come on," he said. "We'll go to the north. Elvis can stay here with the slaves." "You better be right about this, Apollo." Apollo was sure that they were right, if they could only find an object that they could use their powers to back up their theory. Instead, they had to trust their instinct. It was somewhat comforting that the other party members also trusted them, despite their status as a newcomer. Thinking on this, Apollo began to open up again to the others as they reached their destination to the north of the Ark. They described their life before reaching the Ark. Craig again seemed bored and uninterested. Apollo became frustrated at being ignored and started to weave a tale that was not entirely accurate. "Then, after the leader died, we had a new leader called, Bora. Yeah, and Bora was a real jerk with his stupid fat ass. They never threw anything away, and they carried all their possessions in a big bag. Any time there was trouble, Bora would reach into her bag and somehow pull out something that would help us. But, yeah, they were a real dumbass. She wore rags and everyone only liked her because her husband was still super cool, handsome guy, you know. Having not listened to much of what Apollo had to say, the party were now closely scrutinizing this tale of Bora. Eventually Craig stopped Apollo and said, "You can't be serious. This Bora person, your whole story, why, it's just a thinly veiled critique of Flora's faults and foibles." Apollo replied, "No, it's not." Craig insisted that, yes, it is, only for Apollo to again reply that it's really not. Now it was Steve's turn to speak. "Why, I do believe, good sir, that the story of Bora is nothing more than a metatextual character assassination of a beloved member of our Ark." Apollo paused for a second and said, "You keep using that word, but I don't think you know what it means." Steve continued, "Why, if I could be so bold as to state that in my humble opinion, this whole sorry episode makes you look like a smug, angry, hate-filled little man." "Who, me?" Craig asked. Steve responded, "No, I'm referring to Apollo." Craig went on to say, "Oh, hey, yeah, that's right, and another thing." A huge screened set of jaws came charging at the party. Inside these jaws were several rows of razor-sharp teeth. The discussion the party had engaged in had completely distracted them from the dangers of their surroundings, and now the ambushing creatures looked set to rip them to shreds. Craig, Steve, and Apollo screamed in terror. Rubo was unmoved, however, as just as the creature was set to pounce, Rubo's massive arm came crashing down onto the creature's jaws. A hideous crunch sound was heard, as by this time Craig, Steve, and Apollo had shut their eyes. When they opened their eyes, they witnessed Rubo smashing the creature into the ground, killing it within seconds. Rubo turned to the others and calmly said, "Target neutralized." Relief and gratitude overwhelmed the humans. Rubo had saved their lives. Their previous disagreements, now long forgotten, work began on finding what was infecting the water. It did not take them long to find a stash of corpses, mostly animal, that the creature had apparently stashed away in its nest in the river. With Rubo unable to get wet due to risk of short-circuiting, Craig, Steve, and Apollo spent the rest of the afternoon clearing out the dead bodies from the river. Apollo was confident that the Ark was saved. After resting for a short while, the group began to march back towards Elvis and the slaves. They decided that they would explain that corpses had polluted the river, but that they had solved the issue and that everyone could return home. It was felt best not to mention that the creature they had killed looked an awful lot like Elvis. Steve was confused, saying, "But that creature was obviously an alligator. Elvis is part crocodile, so what's the issue?" It was later at night when the party made it back to the Ark. They passed by the Flora statue, which still looked odd with its bottom on the front. It would take some getting used to, even for an Ark full of mutants. The party stepped inside the Ark and were greeted with the usual cheers and applause. The cheering and applause was much subdued, however, as precious few residents were well enough to greet them. Most were falling ill to the red pox. The clean water was helping the sick patients to survive, but it was doing nothing to quell the spread of the virus. If the Ark was to survive, then a cure was needed. That was the conclusion of the small meeting of elites in the elders' quarters. A debate was held in the morning to discuss the best course of action. Again, it was Apollo who came up with the solution. They suggested heading back to the hospital and looking for a cure there. Craig and Steve admitted that the hospital was very large with much to explore. If a cure was to be found anywhere, then it stood to reason that it would be in storage somewhere at the hospital. All further projects of the Ark were put on hold until the epidemic was stopped. It was impractical to work on new structures whilst half the Ark was in quarantine. Besides, the statue of Flora was completed. The pinnacle of the Ark's culture had been reached. All other works were obsolete in the face of her loveliness. At least that's what Craig told people. Rubo had not even met Flora yet, and felt that the generators that provided the electricity to power his robot body were more important. Craig just shook his head. They just didn't understand how awesome she was, though at least the statue would help them to appreciate just how special she was. Yeah. Chapter 11. Eden is 100% definitely in space. It was late at night when Flora looked through the bars on the quarantine room window and saw a shooting star pass by the window. She made a wish as it went. She wished for the sickness to be over. She swore an oath to herself that once the red pox had finally gone from her body, she would never take her life for granted again. She vowed to live every day to the fullest. No more would she be afraid of the unknown. She would brave the wastes of her husband and see what the world had to offer. For now, she had to content herself with the continued efforts in learning to read. If she could finish the copy of Dante's Inferno that Apollo had kindly lent her, Then everyone would be so proud. She was sure she could master the strange markings on the page. Dante's Inferno would have to wait, however. First, she would complete the book Craig had given her, entitled Learning How to Read for Dummies. At least, that's what she was told it was called. A horrific crashing sound woke up the residents of the Ark. A bright light had momentarily lit up the entire building, but darkness soon ascended once again. There was a great deal of commotion as the heroes of the Ark scrambled to the elders' quarters for a report. Yet nobody was able to explain where the noise had come from. A small troop of scavengers quickly patrolled the perimeter of the Ark and found nothing. With the Ark seemingly secure, the residents went back to their beds. Only Flora had witnessed the crash and fall, though she believed it to be a fever dream. Early the next morning, talk of the previous night's events found its way to Flora. Hearing of the great crash, she thought back to what she had believed was last night's dream. Not wishing to risk embarrassing herself by telling others of the dream, she confided in her best friend Eve, who was also lying in the quarantine room and quite badly sick with the red pox. Eve listened intently to the tale and came to the conclusion that it was likely a dream, but that dreams were sometimes prophecies of the future. Eve insisted on informing the elder of the prophecy. Initially dismissive of their story, the elder told them to get back to bed and to not disturb them with their childish nonsense. There were no secrets in the Ark, and word travelled fast. The two underbosses, Marlott and Finch, quickly learned of Flora's prophecy. Both bosses had rallied their men and headed north to investigate. Neither had informed the elder. Feeling as paranoid as ever, the elder called the loyalist of his non-quarantined scavengers, Craig, Steve, Rubo, and Apollo, to his quarters. The two men and two non-gendered individuals quickly gathered to await the elder's instructions. What they heard was of no great surprise. The elder was suspicious of his underlings' motives. There was talk that they had fallen from the sky had come from Eden, the mythical place that many had believed all life originated from. The party were tasked with reaching the crash site first and securing whatever it was that had fallen from the sky. With no time to lose, the party set off from the Ark. As the elder was feeling especially paranoid, no companion was assigned to assist them. Craig speculated that the elder might even be arranging for their usual companions to be setting off in a group of their own to the crash site. He hoped that a civil war would not break out. Apollo stated that they felt it was crazy for everyone to be getting so excited just because something had fallen from the sky. There was nothing to suggest that it had actually come from Eden, or that such a place even existed. Nobody had any conception of what it could be, and Apollo argued that it could simply be a mutated creature that had caught fire. A mutated creature from Eden, probably, said Steve. Knowing the wastes like few others, Craig led the party quickly northwards, finding a path through the thick woods of the north. Craig and Steve were familiar with the area from their previous mission in liberating the logging camp. Craig thought back to the fight at the camp and shuddered. If only he had protected Flora, maybe she would not have taken that vial of acid to the face. The path through the woods allowed the party to gain on Finch and Marlott, and the party also made swift progress through the glassified fields that surrounded the woods. One wrong step could doom them, but following in Craig's footsteps, they quickly made it through acres of dangerous terrain. Fire in the abandoned town of Acknowledgements indicated where the thing had collided with the earth. The party rushed through derelict industries to reach the crumbling ruins of a whole ton. The ruins were ablaze, undoubtedly due to the thing that fell from the sky. Yet upon closer inspection, it was obvious to Apollo that whatever had landed was no longer there. A great tear on the ground indicated that the thing had skidded off to the southwest. The party debated their next move. Steve insisted that whatever had come to the earth had fallen from Eden. Eden is definitely in space, he claimed. Craig felt that it was best that they return to the Ark to report their findings. Apollo disagreed, saying it was best to head southwest and investigate further. Marlott came across the party as they were squabbling among themselves. Soon Finch also found them. The two underling bosses were not surprised to see the party. "Doesn't trust us, eh?" smiled Marlott. Finch laughed in response. "Years of loyal service, and he still can't trust us, eh? That's our elder, all right." All agreed that there was nothing more for any of them to see there, and Marlott and Finch offered to accompany the party back to the Ark. Yet Apollo took Craig aside and again insisted that they should head southwest. "We must be getting back to the Ark," Craig said. "It would be risky following the trail of fire. Whatever landed has long since burnt up." Feeling as though they were losing control of the situation, Apollo shrieked, "Nobody said you had to come!" Craig was taken aback by his companion's cheerless remark. Hearing raised voices, Ruo and Steve gathered round to see what was going on. "Explain your remark," ordered Craig. Apollo blushed, and after gathering their thoughts went on to say, "I feel that something of immense importitude is mustered westerly and southerly to where we most currently are located. Insofar and inasmuch as it is our solemn duty to serve the Ark, we must abide these post-haste as responsible Ark members, particularly when two Scavengers are not as strong as the others. And yes, I did say that nobody said you had to come, because it is a factual statement, that at no time did anybody state that you were being forced to go southwest against your will." Craig, Steve and Rubo stood in silent annoyance. Eventually, Craig called Marlott and Finch over to him and stated that the new plan was for the party to return to the Ark, sans Apollo, who would go with Marlott and Finch to the southwest to hunt the source of the crash. Apollo was delighted and was quick to show it. Apollo explained to Craig that, "I'm happy to go with Marlott and Finch. It's not that I hate you or anything, it's just that I've decided to focus on Scavengers, my own skill range, because I enjoy their company more." Craig walked away to silently fester on these comments, and bid Steve and Rubo to follow him back to the Ark. Apollo and their new friends skipped hand in hand to the southwest. They held deep conversations about Eden, the Ark, and the meaning of their existence. The time seemed to fly by as they soon reached crumbling ruins that now had a large metallic structure embedded within them. The structure was still smoking and had clearly impacted on the ruins very recently. Apollo reached for their sketchbook and quickly drew what they saw. A small satellite that had the word Eden stamped on the side. Marlott investigated the area and Apollo sketched. Marlott found a photograph of men and women in white clothing. She asked Finch to examine it, though Finch was unable to make anything of it. Finch had also found something of interest, a small artefact. With the sketch now complete, Apollo stared at the photograph. It seemed alien, yet familiar. Apollo reached out to touch it and was instantly struck by a vision. The vision was of the future. It showed Apollo, though she was not with her new friends, Marlott and Finch. She was with Craig, Steve and Rubo, as well as with Flora. It showed them all celebrating aboard a truck. The truck was driving away from the Ark. It was part of a convoy of trucks, each filled with all the people and possessions of the Ark, as well as tons of food supplies. The statue of Flora was being dragged behind the final truck. What a strange future, Apollo thought. However could such a scenario occur? They thought to themselves that that scenario would never happen. Steve and Craig were deep in conversation on the way back home. Craig was saying how much of a jerk Apollo was. Steve would reply with, "So what? You love Flora, not Apollo." Craig had to concede to Steve made a good point. Steve went on to say that Eden is definitely in space. Rubo and Craig were not convinced, though Steve was adamant. After Steve said Eden is in space for the 50th time, Rubo hit him on the head with his robot fist. They carried on walking in silence, though Steve still muttered to himself, "It definitely is in space." Deciding to take a different route home, Craig, Steve and Rubo traversed through barren fields that seemed completely abandoned by all forms of life, when suddenly a loud buzzing sound filled the air. The buzzing noise quickly became overwhelming. Suicidal thoughts entered Craig and Steve's heads as they began to scream. 3 giant grasshoppers appeared from over the horizon and began to fly directly at the party. Craig and Steve were by this time lying on the ground screaming and beating their fists at their heads. The grasshoppers came closer, greedily eyeing up their prey. Craig knew he was going to die, and he welcomed death. Death would mean silence and darkness. It would mean an escape from the sounds that filled his head. The silence came, though only after 3 large explosions. Craig and Steve slowly opened their eyes. They saw 3 giant grasshoppers lying dead on the ground, their bodies blown wide open. "Threat neutralized," said Rubo, as the missile launchers retreated from his shoulders and into his back. "I didn't know you could do that," Craig shouted. "Neither did I," replied Rubo. The men got to their feet, and the 3 friends continued their journey towards the Ark. Craig and Steve were shaken by the experience, but felt a whole lot safer with Rubo around. Craig, Steve and Rubo were in the Elder's quarters when Apollo returned with Marlott and Finch. The Elder was still suspicious, but was quickly reassured by Apollo, who assured him that Marlott and Finch were as loyal to him as ever. Finch handed over the artefact he had found, which the Elder reasoned was something he would not do if he was plotting against him. They examined the artefact. It was a small construct, shaped like a disc with a hole in the middle. The Dawnvault librarian was summoned to see what they could make of the construct. Almost immediately upon inspecting it, the librarian shouted, "Eureka!" and rushed off to the Dawnvault, with the others in quick pursuit. Having faced or locked the door, the librarian ran to the dorm vault and fished out the device that had been stolen by Larry many moons ago. They jammed the disc-like structure inside and began to poke at the buttons. The elder and the party stood in silence and then in shock as the device kicked into life. A voice appeared out of the device. It was a voice none of them recognized. It spoke of things they could not comprehend. Eden Laboratories, Edinburgh Division report. The experiment is a failure. Subjects deceased. Eden Laboratories. Brighton Division report. The experiment is a failure. Subjects killed themselves. Eden Laboratories, Manchester report. The experiment is a failure. Subjects lost. Eden Laboratories, Stafford Division report. Experiment still in progress. Subjects living. Continue testing, Stafford. They had finally heard confirmation of Eden's existence. Steve was shocked that it was not in space. It seemed that there had once been many Edens. The Edens referred to as Edinburgh, Brighton and Manchester baffled them. However, the elder stroked his chin and told them that there had been talk in the before times of a place called Stafford to the south of Stoke. He had not been, but was sure that with enough food supplies they could soon reach there. It was decided that once the disease was cured, then their next move would be to find a way to Stafford. Steve suggested they commandeer the trucks of the food warehouse and drive them to Eden. A fine suggestion, Craig agreed. But first let's go to the hospital. Flora's horrific face injury was fixed at the hospital. If there's anything we can find a cure for redpox, it's there.
Chapter 12. Rubo, friend. Fresh water flowed into the ark. The residents, both sick and healthy, felt refreshed when they drank the clean water. Before the party's heroic efforts, every sip of water brought fear of further illness. However, the redpox still spread. Every day more residents were struck down by the disease. The latest to reluctantly cross into the ever-expanding quarantine zone was Elon, the great man-bear. One of the most fearsome fighters in the Ark was reduced to a shivering wreck. Elon feared for the future of his people. He feared the misery and isolation of quarantine, but most of all he feared being apart from his wife. Serena and Elon were an odd-looking couple. Elon, a hulking beast at 2 meters tall, was covered in thick hair and was a menacing sight with his sharp teeth and claws. By contrast, his wife Serena was tiny. She was much shorter than even Flora, barely coming up to Elon's waist. She did, though, share one thing in common with him, as she too was a half-human, half-animal hybrid. She shared her DNA with that of a chinchilla. As such, her appearance was almost comical to some, particularly when she stood next to her husband. A woman of great empathy, she could barely control herself as Elon was guided through the large double doors that now separated the healthy and the sick. Waves of sickness spread through the victims of redpox. Some days they were largely functional and were expected to look after the more sickly patients, but these days soon passed into days of heavy fever, leaving the patient bedridden and expelling bodily fluids at an alarming rate. The strong were greatly weakened as the disease took its toll. Those who were already weakly struggled to survive, and the death count slowly climbed as the days turned into weeks. All who had so far been infected continued to be plagued with red sores across the face and body. It seemed as if a cure would be needed. Nature was the enemy. Science was their only hope. The elder gathered the remaining heroes of the Ark, Craig, Steve, Apollo, and Rubo, to his quarters and explained to them that he had come close to abandoning all hope. He put it bluntly. "You have saved the Ark before. You have to save us again." Craig sighed. As he had already lost Flora to the disease, she lay sick in the quarantine zone, and Gramslinger had foolishly managed to get himself exiled into slavery. All that remained of him was trusty Steve, the terrifying Rubo, and the irritating Apollo. He had to admit that they had proved useful allies thus far, though. A discussion was held as to how they could and where they could find a cure for the redpox. The hospital was their only idea put forward. They knew it was a long shot, but it was one that simply had to work. Redpox had claimed all but a handful of experienced wasteland traversers, leaving only Serena to join the party on their mission. She greeted the party solemnly. They all knew that their failure would mean the end of the Ark and all that they held dear. The only option was to succeed, no matter the cost. Craig led the way as the party marched west. Grazers munched at the radioactive grass, oblivious to the goals and worries of the group of mutants that were storming past them. After some hours, the party found themselves in the dead woods south of stoke-on-trent. A dense forest had covered the area only a week ago, before Gary's reckless return home had sent the entire area up in flames.
Ash covered the ground now, a stark reminder of how quickly things change. It seemed to Craig only yesterday that he was waking up in a comfortable bed next to Flora, planning the surprise statue in her honour. He thought back to that book, which the stonemason had inexplicably placed at the front of the statue. The anger fueled him as Steve began to lag behind. Craig called back, "Eden's not in space, is it?" Steve felt his blood boil, and with a burst of energy he sprinted towards Craig with the intention of giving him a piece of his mind. Once the hospital was in sight, the party stopped to rest and evaluate their plan of action. The hospital was huge, and they had no idea where to look for a possible cure. Rubo told the others that he could reason with the robot on sentry duty at the front. If that failed, he could always overpower him and force their circuits together to raid the sentry's databanks. Craig, Steve, and Apollo didn't know what that meant exactly, but agreed that it sounded kind of gay. Rubo led the way as the party approached the hospital's front entrance, taking them through the long grass. His powerful robot legs marched onward, but seemed to get shorter, or perhaps the grass was simply getting longer. Craig stopped for a moment and concluded that, no, it was Rubo's legs getting shorter. The giant robot quickly disappeared entirely from view before a loud explosion rang out from where he had vanished to. Smoke rose from the sky as the others looked at each other in horror. They rushed to where Rubo had disappeared, forcing past the long grass. It was Apollo who reached him first, and they discovered that Rubo's legs were now detached from the rest of the robot's body as a smoking crater emanated from Rubo's torso. The three human party members stood staring at their robot friend before Steve eventually spoke out. "What happened?" Rubo turned to face Steve and replied, "Threat eliminated. Error. Also have eliminated my midsection." The others looked around and noticed flesh and bloody strewn across the nearby grass. Rubo had launched a rocket at the unknown creature, but had attacked itself in confusion. Craig and Apollo looked at Steve and asked if repair was possible. Steve blew out his cheeks and said, "Sure, just get me something to fill in the hole." Apollo rushed out of the tall grass in search of an appropriate object to stuff into Rubo's hole. They came across an abandoned construction site and were struck with an idea. Apollo called out to Craig and Steve, "Come help me." Apollo needed help bringing the device back to Rubo. None of them could theorize what the device could be, though Craig read the word cement mixer on the side. It certainly looked like something roughly approximate to a stomach. Craig reached into his back pocket and fished out an oxyacetylene cutter, a parting gift from Flora. He handed the cutter to Steve, who quickly set to work attaching the cement mixer to Rubo's front. Rubo was extremely grateful for the medical attention, saying things such as, "Stop, foolish humans," and "I do not consent, I do not consent." Steve worked quickly and sloppily, resulting in Rubo's legs being reattached to his body through the cement mixer. Rubo stood up. He looked ridiculous, but he was able to function much as he did before firing a ballistic missile at himself. Rubo looked at his new torso, and Apollo was sure they saw Rubo frown, but that wasn't possible, as Rubo was a robot and had no emotions. Rubo did not thank Steve for his hard work, and simply said, "Wait here, humans, I will interact with the sentry box." He walked slowly towards the hospital entrance, seemingly unsure of the stability of Steve's handiwork. Craig, Apollo, and Steve hid behind a burnt-out vehicle and observed Rubo in action. They saw him converse with the other robot, then point towards the hospital. The sentry bot turned its head to Luke, and Rubo then jammed his fist into the back of the robot's head. Some beeping noises and flashes of electricity later, and the sentry bot powered down, and Rubo beckoned the others to join him. Craig approached Rubo with some trepidation, not merely because of the robot violence he had just witnessed, but because he feared that Rubo would tell him that a scan of the machine's memory banks showed him that there was no cure at the hospital. However, Rubo did not disappoint his human companions, and instead told them, "Science laboratory and hospital detected. Disease control department. Outlook of finding cure for redpox disease. There." Craig breathed a sigh of relief. There was still hope. More hope, in fact, than there had been at the start of their journey. With Rubo now containing a full map of the facility in his databanks, he led the party down the shady corridors of the facility. Craig and Steve were fearful as they thought back to their previous experience of the facility. Flora's quick thinking had saved them from the zone ghouls last time, but if they were ambushed again, then they might not prove to be so lucky. Craig asked Rubo for reassurance, or at least he had discovered any information on possible enemies from his interaction with the sentry robot. Rubo gave a guarded response, saying that zone ghouls were infrequent visitors to the site, but that they were not the only creatures that could be hiding in the darkness. Craig felt a chill run down his spine. Rubo certainly didn't seem like a typical robot. He even seemed to be taking some sort of pleasure from unnerving the rest of the party. Even more peculiar, he found, was that the great machine had ripped a blanket from a hospital bed and draped it around his waist. Surely a machine could not feel embarrassment, even if their torso now bore a cement mixer. How much did they even know about Rubo, he wondered, and how did the machine get to arrive at the Ark in the first place? He looked around and noticed that Steve and Apollo were also looking extremely nervous. He wondered if they too were feeling suspicious over their giant robot ally. Apollo thought to themselves how eerily quiet the hospital was. They felt their nose begin to twitch, as it was wont to do in times of stress. They hoped the others would not pick up on it. Then again, thought Apollo, Craig and Steve didn't really seem to care at all if Apollo was even around or not, whilst Rubo didn't have emotions at all. They felt as though it didn't matter if they were there, and if they didn't return to the Ark, would anyone actually care? Apollo removed the bandages from their eyes. Apollo didn't need their eyes to see and preferred to keep them hidden from others. This would be a test, they thought, to see if anybody would even notice the change. Craig did a double take upon seeing Apollo without the bandage around their eyes. "Hey, Apollo, why have you taken your bandage off?" Craig hissed. Apollo mumbled a reply and then rewound the bandage around their eyes. What a jerk, Apollo thought to themselves, asking me a personal question like that. That's not nice. Steve hadn't noticed that the bandage had been removed. He was too busy trying to concentrate on what was round the next corner. Enemies could strike at any moment, he said to himself. Steve was determined not to be caught off guard. After many minutes of walking, Rubo eventually stopped outside a large white door. Craig noticed that the sign on the door read Disease Control. This seemed to be the place. Rubo led them inside and immediately removed the end of one of his fingertips, revealing a device hidden inside. He placed his hand next to a computer that was sitting on a desk inside the room. His eyes began to glow. Craig's heart stopped, but then Rubo's eyes returned to normal, and he turned to face the others. He said, "The disease you referred to as redpox was known as Poison H. The scientists here had an antidote. Those antidotes are stored in the adjacent room." Craig let out a long, loud cheer. Flora and the others would be cured. All they had to do was return home safely. The party rushed to the refrigerated room next door and searched for the antidote. The search did not take long, as Craig read the labels and found over 200 vials resting on a tray on a shelf in one of the chilly compartments. There was thousands of other vials, but the party were interested only in the vials marked Infection H. Apollo was hesitant. "How will we get them home?" they asked. It was then that Rubo whipped off the bedsheet covering his torso and gestured to the exposed cement mixer. Steve smiled. He knew his invention would come in useful. With the Ark's future secure inside Rubo, the party exited the refrigerated room and set about heading for home. Yet they were not alone. Out of the darkness there came a deep growling sound. Steve turned to face the noise, but was blindsided by a giant fist. He fell to the floor unconscious. Rubo arched their back as the missile launchers encased within were revealed. Yet without warning they began to power down. Within moments Rubo stood rooted to the spot, devoid of all signs of motion. A huge tail cracked the air. Apollo was hit. They fell to the floor, clutching their stomach, and felt their blood, their life essence, escaping in front of their eyes. Craig saw only a flash of brilliant white light and then nothing. The entire party were entirely incapacitated. Chapter 13. The Last Train to Stafford. There was a slight scent of cinnamon wafting through the room. The walls were eggshell white, as were the floor and ceiling. Apollo sat up in bed and looked around them. Craig and Steve were also in beds, but were sleeping. Rubo was lying dormant in a corner. Apollo looked down at their stomach and saw a fresh bandage. They felt a pain there. The pain was acute, but manageable. Apollo felt at their face and sensed a fresh bandage around their eyes. Panic surged throughout Apollo. How did they get there? They had seemed to be seconds from death at the hospital. The creature that attacked them did not look the type to nurse its victims back to health. Steve was the next to wake up. He groaned and reached for his head, though the headache was quickly forgotten as Steve looked around to take in their new surroundings. Apollo had no answers for Steve. He climbed out of the bed, which had bedsheets that were unnaturally white and cushions that were sterile and clean. Nothing like the bed existed in the Ark, and from what they had seen at the hospital they had investigated, the beds had been covered with years of dust and grime. This room was like nothing he had seen before. He shook Craig awake, and was equally confused by the room. None of them could fathom how or why they had found themselves in such an alien environment. All eyes turned to the door as it opened, though Apollo's eyes were covered by a bandage. No one knew how they could see, and nobody had been curious enough to ask. In walked a beautiful but severe-looking young woman, though she did not greet the party, and instead simply turned and held the door open for someone else. The party watched as a man entered. He was dressed in a white lab coat, had a bandana on his head, glasses, and also wore a long beard. The woman reached for a folding chair that had been resting unnoticed against the wall nearby, and set the chair up so that the man could sit down. The woman spoke, telling the stunned party that, "This is Professor K, redacted. He will answer all your questions." Apollo asked the first question. "Your name is Professor Redacted?" "It's actually Professor Redacted. Note the hyphens. But you can call me K if you wish," said the professor. Steve asked, "Why is your name Redacted?" The professor looked at Steve with a puzzled expression. "Well, my father was Mr. Redacted, and I was granted professorship status several years after completing my doctoral thesis, which, incidentally, was entitled How to Irritate and Confuse Idiots in 30 Seconds or Less. But I am a busy man, so if you have no more questions, then I'll leave." Craig interrupted the professor and burst out a series of questions. "Wait, who are you? How did we get here? What attacked us? Why are we here? When can we leave? We need to get back to save the Ark." The professor turned to face Craig and began to answer his questions. "Well, as I have said a number of times now, my name is Professor K, redacted. I have a doctoral thesis entitled—" Apollo interrupted the professor. "You have said all this. What Ark are you from? Why did you put us here? What's going on?" The professor processed the barrage of questions that Craig and now Apollo had peppered him with. He shuffled in his seat and then told them, "I work for Eden Industries, my Ark, if you will, and my job is to help further the human race by keeping an eye on various Arks and observing their progress. I have watched your Ark with great interest, and, well, seeing you about to be killed by that abomination when you were so close to saving your people, well, I could not accept that scenario, and so I saved your lives. I neutralized the creature, which incidentally was a creation of the sentry bot you had encountered. I'm surprised that such a primitive machine was able to create life, but I received many surprises in this job. I commandeered the room for your convalescence, and you are free to return to your Ark as soon as you feel able. The door is not locked." The professor stood up as his assistant opened the door. He clicked a button on a remote he was holding, and Rubo began to whir into life. The professor then sprinted out of the room, with his assistant keeping pace behind him. Apollo attempted to give chase, but could not see which way they had gone to from the corridor outside, and soon returned to join the others, who were examining Rubo. They were relieved to find that the vaccines were still stored securely inside Rubo's cement mixer. The giant robot seemed embarrassed and worried that they were unable to explain what had happened or why they had powered off. Craig questioned Rubo about Eden, though the robot seemed genuinely devoid of any information on the topic. All 4 party members were confused, but, knowing that there was no time to waste, they soon gathered themselves and hurried out of the hospital. A different route home was chosen. Stoke-on-Trent was completely deserted, save for wandering dogs that took one look at the giant Rubo and thought better of harassing the party for scraps of food. The party ran hard through the ruins and made record time wading through the marshlands that separated Stoke-on-Trent with Fenstown. Progress through Fenstown was swift, as the area was also strangely dead. As they neared the Ark, they half expected the Rat King to make an appearance, but they managed to reach the Ark's entrance without any combat whatsoever. Only the Elder was there to greet them, with seldom few now untouched by the red pox. The Elder was forlorn and close to madness with worry as he questioned the party on what they had found. The relief on his face was palpable as Rubo opened his cement mixer stomach to reveal the antidotes inside. Rick began immediately on injecting the sick with the liquid found in the vials. There was no time to see if there were any ill effects. If the antidote did not work, then they were doomed regardless, and death would be a sweet release from the suffering of the disease. Recovery was rapid in the patients, as the ugly red blotches quickly disappeared from their skin. It seemed as if the party had saved the Ark once again.
However, the side effects were soon apparent. Elon was the first to fall asleep after being cured. Others soon followed him into unconsciousness. It was decided to let them rest after their ordeal. Those that did not fall asleep became quickly irritable. Craig held Flora in his arms and saw the crimson blotches fade away, only to form red mist of anger across her feminine features. She initially was eager to learn what they had seen whilst she was in quarantine, but began to grow impatient as Craig told her of the water supply issue and the journey to the hospital. He went to excuse himself for a toilet break after the third time she slapped him across the face. By the time Craig had returned from the toilet, all hell had broken loose in the quarantine room. Violence had erupted as formerly sickly patients raged and turned to blows in their anger. It was apparent that the antidote came with a side effect. Craig rushed to meet Steve and Apollo, and the trio ran to the Elder's room. Seeing Rubo, Craig ordered the robot not to attack any Ark residents, no matter the provocation. The three humans rushed into the Elder's room and bolted the door shut. It was then that Craig noticed that the Elder laying on his bed, completely undisturbed by the commotion. Craig noticed that he was not breathing and checked for a pulse. The Elder was dead. His tired face looked peaceful. With no signs of struggle, it seemed he had simply died in his sleep. Seldom few died of old age in the Ark, but for the Ark's leader, it was the end. All the Elder's possessions were placed against the door to keep the unruly mob that were hammering away from trying to get inside. Apollo suggested that they fight their way out, but Craig and Steve insisted that they would be killed in seconds, and insisted that staying shut in the room and waiting to see if the residents' anger subsided was the only course of action available to them. Craig, Steve and Apollo sat in the small room for several hours as the mob screamed and shouted outside. With the Elder's corpse lying quietly in the corner, it was not a night that any of them cared to endure again. Luckily, by the time morning came, the anger of the residents had completely subsided. With only silence heard from outside the room, Apollo tentatively opened the door after shifting the barricade aside. The residents were standing around looking rather worse for wear. Many of them were bruised and bleeding, though all were apologetic for their behaviour. It was apparent that the side effect of the antidote had worn off. Flora rushed to hug Craig and started to blurb. "I'm sorry I was such a jerk. I don't know what came over me. For all that time I just felt a compelling urge to be a complete dick for no apparent reason. Can you ever forgive me?" Craig just grunted and went to check on the quarantine room. Unfortunately, Elon and dozens of other residents were still sound asleep. No amount of waking could get them up. The side effect was not temporary. Half of the Ark were in comas. After the shock of the Elder's death had sunk in, arguments broke out as to what to do next. A cure had to be found for the comatose people, and the hospital was unlikely to provide it, as Apollo had reasoned that it was the hospital that had caused them to get in such a state. Serena's squeaky voice was heard over the crowd. She demanded that the Ark leave the cursed lands of Stoke and leap for Eden in Stafford. Steve disagreed. He was still sure that Eden was in space. With no Elder left alive, Craig decisively stood into the leadership role. "We're all going to Stafford," he shouted. The crowd cheered. It seemed a radical and impossible notion. How to relocate the Ark to Stafford? All had been tasked with figuring out how it was to be done. Apollo looked outside and saw the large truck parked there. The solution seemed obvious to such a sharp mind as Apollo. They asked Craig how the truck arrived there, and thoughts immediately turned back to the food warehouse. It was filled with trucks, not to mention supplies. Craig looked to Rubo, and now they had the perfect person to convince the robots of the warehouse to help them. Apollo got into the back of the truck whilst Rubo sat shotgun next to Craig and Steve in the cab of the truck. It would have been more natural for the robot to get into the back of the truck, but Apollo was very sullen and insistent on sitting in the back. "I always sit in the back when I get into a vehicle," they lied. Unfazed by such bullshittery, Craig drove the party west to the food warehouse, as the robots had ensured that the truck had enough fuel to reach its destination and back again. Rubo got out of the truck and marched straight up to the main frame of the warehouse control room. He removed the tip of one finger and inserted his hand into the computer. The robots immediately got to work, filling all the trucks with fuel and supplies, then stood idle as the truck's self-driving mechanism kicked in. A huge convoy of trucks was soon making its way towards the Ark, with Craig, Rubo, Steve and Apollo leading the way. The journey back to the Ark took the convoy past a large minefield. A beep boop indicated a robot presence. "Greetings, I am Minesweeper Bob," said a voice. A rocket fired out from Rubo and obliterated the source of the voice. "Target eliminated," said Rubo. The residents of the Ark were ready for the truck's return.
and the sleeping patients were quickly loaded into the trucks, stacked side by side and one atop the other. All the artifacts and supplies were loaded onto the Ark. One truck at the back was fitted with the Ark's generator and water wheel and sundial, whilst the statue of Flora was towed behind, dragging along the ground. Everyone and everything had been packed onto the trucks, with one exception. Apollo was sitting atop the stairs inside the Ark, whilst everyone else had been working and getting the convoy ready. Apollo thought of Flora's statue being ruined by the upcoming journey, and groaned as they said to themselves, "Oh, that's made my day, that has." They looked up from the game of tic-tac-toe they were playing, and saw that the convoy was slowly driving away. Apollo rushed out of the Ark and sprinted after the truck, shouting, "Oi, wait for me!" Sitting on the back of the final truck, ensuring the precious statue was undamaged, were Flora and Creed.
They looked at Apollo, running in a vain attempt to catch them, and let out a hearty laugh, before embracing in a kiss. Apollo stopped running and began to shake their fist at the fleeing trucks, and shouted, "I hate you, Flora! I hate you!"
Acknowledgements. The author is indebted to Kieran Nock for his excellent work as a games master, GM, and copy editor. This work would not be possible without him. The author also notes that Amberley, Conrad, and William Nock all played their part in the role-playing campaign.